Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the ever compassionate. I begin this in the name of love, in the name of light, in the name of goodness, and certainly in the name of God, in this heart of mine. I would say it's nice to see you all, but I'll just say it's nice to be seen. And it's so good to have you here with me.
Peace and love, everyone, and welcome to another session of our weekly show on race karma, Rahat al-Arwah, Arabic music, or the tranquility of spirits. Rahat al-Arwah, Arabic music between tradition and spirituality. I am so happy to be joining you for the second session. Again, my name is Ali Hussain. I am a creative writer and an aspiring musician who plays the oud. And this is the second session. Our last session, our first session, we spoke about negative thoughts. And today our session is going to be on fear of death. Fear of death. And we're going to be discussing the way that fear of death plays into music. As I mentioned last week, what I hope to do in these sessions is to basically try and look at each of the themes, the vices that we're discussing. So last week it was negative thoughts, and this week it is fear of death. We're going to be looking at how this vice, how it would look like in music practice, in music playing, and how we would solve this problem in music playing or in the practice of music, and that we're going to try and translate back to our everyday life and to deal with this spiritual issue, this fear that we have of and letting go of transitioning to the spiritual world of the hereafter. And the piece I played for you very briefly as a beginner, it's what's called like an introduction in Maqam Hijaz. And Maqam Hijaz is one of the better known Arabic maqams, and is actually one of those maqams that can be played on the guitar or the piano, Western instruments, and it's a maqam that begins in D. So that's Maqam Hijaz. And Maqam Hijaz is a maqam or a modality in Arabic music that has a very distinctive, intense feeling attached to it, and really specifically this interval here of E flat to F sharp gives this maqam this sort of intense feeling, and what's really fascinating is that Maqam Hijaz is only a little bit different than another maqam, which is Maqam Bayati, and Maqam Bayati sounds like this. They begin on the same note, but this one simple change from E half flat to F to E half flat or E flat to F sharp changes the entire mood of the maqam. And of course, you can also play it like on G, so you can. But the idea here is that there is this really small, very small notes, very small note changes that can change the entire ambiance of the maqam. What I wanted to sort of begin our talk today with is on the subject of death, is a story that I heard a few years back about one of the most well-known and celebrated Egyptian musicians of the 20th century, who's considered a pioneer of the so-called golden age of music, which was like in the mid 20th century, late 20th century to late 19th century to about the mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century, and specifically in Egypt, where you had like the Egyptian diva Kulthum, you had figures like Riyad al-Sumbati, who of course whose taqsim or improvisation in Maqam Rahat al-Arwah is where we get the title of the show from, like Muhammad Abdul Wahab, whom I mentioned last time, and Farid al-Atwash, who I'm referring to here. Farid al-Atwash is actually Lebanese, and he belongs to the Druze sect. It's a religion, it's a religious community of faith that lives in the mountains of Lebanon, and they live around the area, in that area of the Middle East. And Farid al-Atrash and his sister Asmahan, they were really some of the pioneers of this Arabic golden age of music in Egypt. And it's sort of a testimony to the universal power of music that the Druze, Druze brother and sister, like Farid al-Atrash and Asmahan al-Atrash, would become, pioneers of Arabic music in a country like Egypt, where Islam as a religion played a tremendous role in society. But anyways, Farid al-Atrash, he lived with a heart problem, right? He had a heart problem growing up, alongside other issues such as gambling and drinking and stuff he was aware of that he struggled with most, if not all, of his life. But towards the end, what I heard is that when he was on his deathbed, he was in a coma, and either in a coma or in severe pain. And then all of a sudden, he woke up, and people said he looked very young, and he looked very healthy. He looked very happy. He woke up and he looked at everybody around him, and he said to them, I am fine now. You don't have to worry about me. I am doing very well. And he passed away, right? And this is actually not the first time that I have heard stories like this before. I've heard many times, for example, my own maternal grandmother, also in Egypt, before she passed away by a few days, she seemed to have regained her health completely. She seemed to be in very, very good shape, and she was very responsive, and she had stomach cancer, and she was in incredible pain before she passed away. But those few days, she got a second wind, and everybody felt as though she's getting better and she is going to defeat the sickness. But it's the second wind before the transition. And I think this is a really remarkable and a really deep and meaningful idea, right? That I sort of want to make it the focus of our conversation in this session. Specifically, there is two verses in the Quran that I want us to sort of think about in terms of musicology and music, and specifically the idea of death. And what I want to bring into the table in this session is death and life. But from the Quranic perspective, and then we can transition into music. So in the Quran, there is in one verse, God Almighty says, "And He is the one who gave you life, then He gave you death, then He will bring you to life again." Right? So there is this interplay and interchange between death and life, that they are inseparable from one another. Right? And then you have another verse where in chapter 67, where God Almighty says, He is the one who created death and life in order to test you. So in the Quran, there is this idea that life and death are inseparable from one another. They're always together. And we see this idea most vividly in art, and especially most vividly for people who do music or who work with music in music practice. That you cannot think about death without thinking about life. You cannot experience death without experiencing life. And I think that when we only think about death by itself, right? So one of the interesting things is in the Quran, God Almighty also says, we have created you in pairs. And I think that death is also addressed by that verse, that the pair of death, the spouse of death is life. Right? And that the fear of death comes into the picture when we divorce it from its spouse, when we divorce it from life. And similarly, the sort of the fulfillment of life is not achievable, it's not possible if we divorce it from its spouse, which is death. And there is a statement that is attributed to Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is the cousin of the Prophet and his son-in-law, may Allah be pleased with him and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that he said, a statement that's very well known, he said, work for your life as though you are going to live forever, and work for your hereafter as if you're going to die tomorrow. Right? So this idea, this pair, means that they complete one another. They're like the alternation of night and day. And that's why many Sufis have looked at the metaphor of night and day as the metaphor of the unseen and the seen, or the spiritual world and the physical world, in which case night becomes symbolizing not only death, but the transition to the spiritual world. And life, or the day, symbolizes the physical world, right? Life in this physical world. Because everything is seen during the day with the physical eyes. But at nighttime, you need alternate methods. You need different ways in order to see. Specifically, you need to use your insight. And this reminds us of what my dear teacher and maestro of Oud, Dr. Ahmed al-Khatib, mentioned told me that I mentioned last in the previous session, that he was told by one of his own oud teachers that when you play your instrument, when you play the oud, you need to close your eyes and pretend like you are a blind person, someone who is basir. And we said that in Arabic we usually don't refer to people who cannot see with their physical eyes as blind. We call them a'ma. We don't usually use the word a'ma, but we use the word basir, which means he's a person who does not see through their physical sights, but they see through their inner sights. Right? They're people who see through their inner sights. So what Dr. Ahmed al-Khatib, what he was told by his teacher, basically is be dead when you're playing your instrument. And the Sufis also have a statement like an advice that has been transmitted by Sufi saints to their disciples, that the disciple should be like a dead body in the hands of the guide, in the hands of the Sufi guide. That's the only way that the seeker will be able to reach the station. Because the idea is that we cannot accomplish what we need to accomplish by ourselves. Right? We need help. And we need help so much that we need to become not an agent of transformation as much as a channel for divine transformation. Right? And I oftentimes think of the story of the ney, the flute. Right? And as we know that the ney is a very powerful symbol for Sufi mystics, especially in the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Because we know that Maulana Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, may Allah sanctify his secret, who was born in Balkh in present-day Afghanistan, and then he lived most of his life. He migrated as a young child with his father to Konya, and then he lived there and he practiced Sufism as a Sufi guide there, and he's buried there in the city of Konya. He begins his famous poetic compendium of the Methnavi, the couplets, with talking about the ney, where he says, remember the lamentation of the ney as it leaves the reed bed. Right? That this is the whole idea is that the journey begins with separation. Right? The story begins with separation. And I will get back to that in just a second. But let us get back to the ney. The journey, and there's a really beautiful documentary in Turkish on YouTube about the steps to taking a reed from the reed bed, separating it from its familiar environment and transforming it to the ney. That is really powerful, and it's a great symbol for a metaphor for the transformation of death, a particular type of death that we want to talk about. So the first thing that happens to the reed before it's transformed into a ney again is separation. So it's removed from its familiar environment. It's removed from its family. It's removed from its companions. It's removed from its friends. Right? And it is put in an uncomfortable position. And when you and I are in an uncomfortable position or in an unfamiliar place, then our defenses go down. And even though that's a frightening place, that's actually the place where we can become a channel. That's the only way that we can be a channel for transformation to take place. And after that, one of the first steps that happens to the reed is that it is straightened. Right? So it's taken from a reed, and many of these reeds are the right length, but they're not straight, they're crooked. So one of the first steps that happens is that they're burned. And through burning, they become straightened. They actually get cracked and broken in order to become a straight reed, ready, suitable to be a ney. And then it is emptied from the inside, because otherwise the breath cannot pass through it. It has to be completely empty from the inside. For example, the oud is also an instrument that has a hole inside. It is empty. Right? And then after that, what we have is the process of making holes. 7 holes to be precise. 7 holes in the reed. And this is really one of the last stages, the 7 holes that are made into the reed. And we can think of this from the perspective of the reed, from the perspective of the ney. It is actually windows to the unseen. Right? These holes are windows to the unseen. They're the places where the musician can produce music through the ney. So only at that point, after these stages, is the reed now a ney, a musical instrument that is ready to be played by the hand of the musician. And what beautiful music is produced by the ney, and yet everybody knows subconsciously that it is not the ney that makes the music, it's the musician that makes the music. So the point of this whole explanation is that we are also, as seekers, the seeker is also taking a journey to become a ney in the hands of a divine musician. We are also taking a journey to be straightened. Whatever crookedness we have inside of us needs to be straightened, needs to be corrected. And oftentimes that might require a certain type of fire. We need to be emptied from the inside. And then we need our windows to the unseen to be unveiled, to be uncovered. And if we think about the perspective of the reed as it's going through this transformation until it becomes a ney, we can imagine the pain, right, that it's going through as it's experiencing each of these before it's finally able to produce music. And then the end journey, whereas many Sufis have explained that the seeker, that the person, the human being, should be like a cup to receive divine inspiration. I think the ney actually gives us an even more beautiful example, because the cup is a container. Right? The cup is a container. So oftentimes we talk about emptying our cups. So make sure to empty your cup. If you've ever watched the movie 2012, there is a Buddhist seeker, murid, who goes to his guru on top of the mountain, and he tells him, people are saying stuff about the end of the world and all of that stuff, and I'm just really confused. Can you tell me the truth? And then his teacher just starts pouring coffee or tea in his cup, and the cup keeps overflowing. It's like overflowing on the table and on the ground. And then the disciple says, Guru, be careful, you're overflowing. He's like, your brain is like that. Your brain is like this cup. There is too much stuff in it, too many opinions, too many conjectures. Then how are you going to understand the truth if your cup is already full? But I think that the example of the nay is a bit more powerful, because the nay is actually, it's not even a container, it's a channel. You and me, we want to be channels that just pass the divine breath through, so that when people hear the music that you're producing, what they're essentially hearing, they're reminded of the musician, not only of the instrument. Right? This is the power of the nay. Now, I think what's happening with the nay is actually death. It's death and life. It's undergoing a shrouding of some way, the reed, in order to become the nay, in order to be reborn. And we see this metaphor in film, right? So, for example, we know one of the most, beautiful examples of rebirth is, for example, in Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf the Grey becomes Gandalf the White, right? And the way he goes through that is that he falls through the pit, fighting against a demon called the Balrog, and then he's telling the story to his friends Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli after he comes back as Gandalf the White. And he says, I fell through fire and water, right? Exactly the same changes that the nay goes through. He says, and I fought my enemy on the highest peak in the lowest mountain, or something like that. And then he says, after he destroyed his enemy, he says, I passed through space and time. And that moment in the movie, we see that his vision is unlocked. And that's the moment when the veils are lifted and the windows are open to the unseen. And he says, I've been sent back to you now. And they tell him, Gandalf. They remind him of his name. And he says, Gandalf the Grey, that was my name. I am Gandalf the White. The nay is no longer the reed. The reed could not produce music. The reed could not even produce its own music. The nay surpassed the ability to produce its own music. It's now been exalted to the rank of being a channel of transmitting divine music. It's a place where the divine breath passes through. That is death. Right? Just like Gandalf says, passing through fire and water in order to become an instrument, in order to be able to produce music. So that's what we have to go through. Right? We have to go through a type of death in order to be reborn. Now, what is the death? And I think the key is in the scriptural verses that we mentioned. Oftentimes when we read these verses, we might think of the death here as the physical death. That it is when we physically die, our bodies no longer function, and then they put us in a grave in the ground. That's the death. But in reality, the Quranic verses cannot be limited to one meaning. There is infinite meanings there. And so one of those meanings is that this death is actually not the physical death. It's actually the spiritual death. It's the spiritual death. It's the death of the ego. Or as it is called by the Sufis, annihilation, fana. And it is also roughly translatable to nirvana. Right? So what we're talking about is, And we have, for example, Sufi saints tell us, you know, and it's a narration it's a saying that's again transmitted, said to have been said by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, or the Prophet ﷺ, that die before you die. Die before you die. Experience that spiritual death before the physical death. And some Sufi saints, like Maulana Sheikh Hisham Qabbani and Maulana Sheikh Nazim al-Haqqani, they actually say that if you experience the spiritual death, then the physical death will be nothing for you. It will be completely easy to undergo the physical death because you've already underwent it through, you've already experienced it through that spiritual death. And it is an ascension, essentially. That's exactly what it is. It is a peeling off of the layers of the ego, of everything that is external to who we essentially are. Right? So we hear, for example, about Ibn Arabi's own ascension, and he says, as he reached each heaven, he experienced a peeling off of the layers. So in the first heaven, he felt his bodily form peeled off, and then he became a spirit, and then his ability to speak was removed, and his ability to dream was removed, until he reached the divine presence as an object of God's knowledge, inseparable from God's knowledge. And that is essentially who we are. Now, there is another connection here that's really powerful between the nay, between the story of the nay, and this idea of life and death that we're experiencing. Now, we oftentimes think of our life, our physical life in this world, as a much more easy experience, much easier experience than our death. But in reality, our creation, the process of our creation, is actually very similar to the nay, in that the first step was separation. The first step was separation. And the key here is in the name of God, Al-Fatir. So for example, we have an entire chapter in the Quran called Fatir, right? It says, Alhamdulillahi Fatir as-samawati wal-ard. And we usually translate it as, praise be to the one who created the heavens and the earth. But Fatir actually means something specific. It doesn't mean the same as Khaliq. Khaliq means to create. Fatir means something else. Fatir means to split apart. Right? To split apart. So Fatir as-samawati wal-ard means the one who split apart the heavens and the earth. Now, why is that important? Because our creation was a process of being split apart and separated from the divine presence. And we all remember that story of the descent of our father, Prophet Adam, peace be upon him, and our mother Hawa from heaven to earth. That's the separation. That's when our reeds were separated from the reed bed. But the beautiful connection here is that the word fatir is also related to the word fitra, which we like to think as our primordial instinct. And I like to think of it because I have this initiative that I spoke about in the first session, Nostalgic Remembrance. I like to think of fitra as an ancient memory of our presence with God, of our presence in oneness. If you remember, I mentioned one of the saints, Habib Umar bin Hafid. He says the reason human beings love beautiful voices is because it reminds them of when God spoke to them. And that's the memory of being in the divine presence. That memory, and by extension, all our memories, our childhood memories, are included within the blessing of being catalysts for making us journey towards the future, our memories of the past. Right? And nostalgia is oftentimes mistreated nowadays, I feel, even by some artists, by some people. We think of nostalgia as a bad thing, nostalgia as a longing for something that is in the past. Don't get stuck in the past, they'd say. But if we can connect to that ancient memory, and not only that ancient memory of God, but if we can also transform all of our memories of our childhood from the moment we entered upon this earth until now, those memories, if we can sacralize them, if we can appreciate them, if we can love them, those memories will actually help us understand better our place in the divine presence. Right? So we are undergoing a process of death now because we are already separated from that eternal life. But the puzzle seems to be is that we are at once in death and we are at once in life, just as we can experience both night and day in this physical world. Because our ability or our condition of being dead, spiritually dead, where I'm not talking about physical life and physical death, I'm talking about the spiritual life and the spiritual death. Our condition of being physically dead, spiritually dead, and our condition of being spiritually living has to do with our perception and our presence. If we are present with the whatever it is we're doing, and in this case music or art, then we are immediately opening a window for ourselves to experience that primordial presence, just like Habib Omar said, hearing a beautiful sound. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ mentioned about the Quran, and this is one of the most powerful hadiths that really we can write books and books about, where he said, whoever does not melodiously sing the Quran, he is not one of us. And if we reflect on this hadith, we understand that what's essentially being said here is that the meanings of the Quran are unlocked only through singing. That the meanings of the scripture are actually intimately married to the melody. That the melodies are unlocking the verses of scripture. That these verses of scripture cannot be unlocked simply through knowledge of grammar. They cannot be unlocked simply through knowledge of tafsir, right? Or knowledge of tajweed, of proper pronunciation. You need the melody. Once you use the melody, it unlocks. Again, back to Lord of the Rings, we remember when Gandalf, now Gandalf the Grey, is standing in front of the gate to the caves of Moria where the dwarves lived at once, and he's trying his best to unlock the gate, and he's reading the riddle. It says, speak, friend, and enter. And he's trying everything, and it's not opening for him. Until it was pointed out to him by a hobbit, Frodo, and he said, "What's the word for friend in Elvish?" And he said, "Mellon." And as soon as he said Mellon, the gate opened. That password for the meanings of the Quran is melody, by the statement of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So now we have this understanding that our physical life in this earth, our physical life in this world is a bounty. It's life. But the story of the Nay is telling us it's actually also a process of death. And remember, we said that life and death are intertwined and married together. Why? Because it's separation from the true life. Which means that our spiritual death, the annihilation, the fana, the nirvana that we undergo and experience is actually spiritual life. And then again, our physical death is a higher type of life. And this is how we know that death never comes by itself. It always comes with life. And life never comes by itself. It's always come with a type of death. So now let's transition to music. Let's talk about music. It's a long metaphysical, spiritual journey that we just undertook. I want to talk about music. And this is a reflection that has been coming to me for a while now, and I was reminded of it today. I'm recording this on July 4th, on the night of July 4th, and fireworks are outside. So happy Independence Day for those who are celebrating it, and certainly in this tumultuous time that our country is going through, we all need to be worried about our spiritual independence and our spiritual liberation as well, before we can truly experience liberation and independence communally and socially and so on and so forth. But a holiday that takes place in community and society is a reminder, should be a reminder of our spiritual holidays that we need to create. But I was watching today this session. I was watching Tazeen Ayubi's and Lufuki's episode on race karma called Handasat al-Sawt. And I was reminded, and I commented that we don't play our instruments. Our instruments play us. Right? I mentioned the ney, and the oud is the same way. The oud is this is a Turkish oud, and an oud is basically an instrument that consists of wood, which is living. Right? So the wood is living. And the oud, the pieces of wood have been burned, like, for example, the qas'a here, the bowl that I mentioned in the end. Originally, these pieces of wood were straight, right? They were straight pieces of wood. And if you've ever watched, and there's a lot of documentaries on YouTube that show how an oud is made, these pieces of wood were burned through fire and bent in order to become like a bowl, like a womb, right? Like it's pregnant with music. It's pregnant with sound. It's pregnant with music, right? The strings are tightened. It's glued together. It's cut apart. It undergoes that pain from its own perspective in order to be able to produce, sound. Right? That is death. That is death that the wood goes through, a type of journey in order to become this type of life, in order to gain this type of life. Right? And now we come to the musician who is communing with their instrument. And from my own experience of learning the oud, and before that the piano, but really developing a very deep and meaningful relationship with the oud, where whenever I see the oud, something is sort of ignited inside of me before the music even begins, before the music is even played. I came to understand that the oud is actually like a proxy of my spiritual guide. Right? It is there. I am being disciplined, and I think that's what Tazeen and Lufuki were saying on their episode, that that music, when done through spiritual, as part of a spiritual discipline, it is not just music. It is not just a hobby. It's actually discipline, which the word for that in Arabic is tazkiyah. Right? So one of the things that I reflect on is, for example, as I'm playing or I'm learning new pieces, new techniques, I'm discovering all of these problems that I have, weaknesses. And I think to myself, gosh, I don't think these weaknesses are just in my hands. I think these weaknesses are actually part of my ego. My ego is coming out, right? that this instrument, the oud, is bringing out my ego, is making, it's like a mirror, making me face my own Balrog, as if I'm Gandalf and I have to destroy that Balrog. I have to face it. And one of the most beautiful things about art, and one of the most beautiful things about music, for music practitioners, and for me, the oud, one of the most beautiful things about this journey is that it is gentle somewhat. It is rapturous. It is intense. But it is a gentle healing process. The pain is within the healing. So as the musician begins, there was a beautiful article that you can find on Google about the stages of mastering a musical instrument. And they have 4 stages. And when I shared it with my friend Lufuki, he said, this is nothing but spirituality. This is nothing but Sufism. The first stage, they say, is, it's called unconsciously incompetent, which is basically that, you know, and I remember myself when I bought the oud 3-4 years ago, and I said to myself, oh, this can't be difficult. This is really easy. I know Arabic music. I know how to recite Quran using melodies. This is going to be a piece of cake. This is so easy. I know Arabic music. I listen to Kulthum all the time. I listen to Fibid al-Atarsh all the time. I know Arabic music. I know this maqam. And then I get it. I get the oud, and I can't even hold it right. And as my teacher from Jordan, Ustad Umar Abbad, likes to comically tell me when I play something badly, he says, you have nothing to do with this world. That's his comment when I don't know how to play something. Sometimes he just says it's a failure. But I like the part where he says this has nothing to do with this world, meaning that you're not doing anything right, right? But it's this idea of not even being aware of how much work needs to be done in order to even bring out a beautiful sound. That's ultimately all it's about. Right? We die spiritually and get reborn as artists, as musicians, only to produce one beautiful sound, one beautiful color. Right? But that's unconsciously incompetent. We begin and we're like, I got this, and we don't have anything. We can't even hold our instrument correctly. It keeps slipping. And the oud is notorious for that. It's very difficult to hold in the beginning, right? We can't play the note. Our intonation is wrong. Our rhythm is wrong. Everything is wrong. And then we become aware of our shortcomings, right? And then we get to the second stage, or an intermediate stage, which is called consciously incompetent. So we become aware of the fact that we need serious work. We have serious problems. We have serious shortcomings that need help, that need work. And oftentimes, this is the point where many people seek a teacher. For example, I tried to learn the oud by myself for 3-4 years, and then at the end I said, I will only get to a certain stage. After that, I won't be able to do it. I need help. Right? And then we get to the third stage, we would begin to work on something called consciously competent. It might seem that it should be unconsciously competent, but it's actually consciously competent. And consciously competent here means that we are actively thinking about doing everything correct. And all of this is before feeling even comes into the picture. The idea of even being able to express yourself through your music has not even come to the picture, because we're still using our mind now. Am I praying this note correctly? Am I playing this rhythm correctly? Am I doing this correctly? Am I doing this correctly? And then the last stage of mastery, the highest stage, is unconsciously competent. where all the techniques we have learned, where the place of every note on the oud has become part of our memory, that we get to the stage where we are now a channel. Because we are no longer present. And I think it's at that stage that we are not playing the instrument is playing us. We have actually become channels for the instrument to express itself through us. And by the instrument, I mean ultimately God, divinity, is using the instrument to express, because the instrument is a perfect saint. I completely 100% believe that, and I'm convinced of that musical instruments are saints, that the paintbrush of a painter is a saint, that the pen of a poet is a saint, right? Because it's been perfected, and it is teaching you, it is disciplining you to reach the stage where you let go, where you die, so that you can become born again. You can become living in the presence of the One. Right? And this is, I think, the power that music has to give us. The power that music has to give us is that, or art in general, is that the artist or the musician is ironically journeying towards the epitome of joy, the epitome which is the ability to express themselves through their instrument. But essentially, that is the journey that only ends in their undoing. And it's a blissful undoing. It's such a blissful undoing, because you are reaching the place where you become a channel for oneness, for divinity, for tawheed. That is true tawheed. For divinity to express itself through you. One of the saints, he said, whoever proclaims La ilaha illallah is a liar. Whoever says there is no God but God, they're a liar. Why? Because they're proclaiming it through an ego. If you were truthful, you would not be expressing it, it would be expressed through you. And so this is why I believe, today we have many people in our religious communities talking about da'wah, proselytization. Music is perhaps the best form of da'wah, because the ideal way to do da'wah, the ideal way to call people to God, to divinity, to oneness, to truth, is to call them through your being, not through your words. That's why the Sufis have a statement that the tongue of your state is more powerful than the tongue in your mouth. Lisan al-hal aqwa wa a'zam min lisan al-maqal. So your spiritual state and mind as we are indulging our instrument, and I'm not experiencing a heightened spiritual state now because I'm still not even a beginner. I don't consider myself a beginner. But our condition, and hopefully our transformed condition, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now, is what's going to be the proselytization to the oneness, to the spring and the source from which this music is coming from. And so we transition back now in these last 5 minutes to talking about, okay, what does this musicality of death and life, what does that tell us about the way we should live our life and our engagement with death? Well, first we need to understand that, again, death and life are spouses. They're a pair. They never appear separately. They're always together. They're always together. Okay. 2, again, if we regard the universe around us as music, and again, I return to Dr. Ahmed al-Khatib, my dear friend and teacher, the master oudist, who said that a blind person, a person who's basir, processes the universe as sound. And so the idea of being dead with a dead ego, eternally spiritually living, is essentially living in a universe which is entirely musical. It's a soundscape. Our landscapes are soundscapes. That is the universe that an artist lives in. And an artist, a painter, lives in a universe of colors. But even if they're blind, they're imagining the colors through their heart. If we are in that state of being musical in our engagement with the universe, then that means we will automatically perceive the life and death together. We will see them as one. And we will appreciate the presence of life within death and the presence of death within life. And really, on a more practical level, I think a good exercise, perhaps a homework we can think about, is to try engage, for me, like for example, for me, what in my current state, in my current stage of life, learning the oud, having a family, whatever it is, doing this artist residency, this platform, if I were to think of myself as an oud being built, what stage am I at? Am I at the stage of the bowl being made? Am I at the stage of the neck being made? Am I at the stage of the strings being made? Am I at what stage am I at? Similarly, if you're a ney player, it's very easy for you. What state am I at? Where am I in my journey? Without a doubt, we are experiencing a type of death that is leading to life because we are in this physical world, because we are separated from oneness, from the spiritual presence. And we need to find those methods, those music channels, those art channels that ignite that memory of our presence, that beautiful sound that Habib Umar is talking about. I pray this session was beneficial. It was really joyful. I was somewhat frightened because I have not really prepared very well for this session. But I fully trust in the power of music and that it is a divine channel. And so I just decided to hold my oud. I am very happy to talk about this new oud that I received from a very well-known hoja, teacher, an oud maker in Turkey named Mustafa Japçolu. He made a very mesmerizing piece of work, and I'm very honored to own this oud. And I actually gave it a name, Tibhal, which means journey. And so I pray, and I ask you to pray with me that this oud is protected and blessed, and a means for me to share whatever I am meant to share with all of you. And it's a way for me to get nearer to God and to please God and to please the Prophet and to please God's creation. So peace and love, and I'll be looking forward to speaking with you again in the coming weeks. Peace and love. Assalamu alaikum.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the ever compassionate. I begin this in the name of love, in the name of light, in the name of goodness, and certainly in the name of God, in this heart of mine. I would say it's nice to see you all, but I'll just say it's nice to be seen. And it's so good to have you here with me.
Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace, love, and light. This is your brother, Baraka Blue, and you are tuned into Path and Present Podcast on Raise Karma. Yes, y'all, this is week 2. We're back with Raise Karma after week 1, which was a beautiful week, and we were reflecting on thoughts, positive thoughts, the ways that our thoughts become our words, become our actions, become our patterns and our habits and our character and our destiny, and the way to reflect on how to cultivate positive and pure and sincere thoughts. And last week we had Dr. Abdullah Rothman to discuss that and also to get into his model of the soul to set a framework. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check that out, I recommend that you do that, and I think you'll dig it. Man, it's been an honor here to collaborate with Raise Karma. This came about because the people at Raise Karma reached out a few months ago and said they're launching this channel, and they were fans of Path and Present, our podcast that we've been doing for the last few years, and said, what do you think about doing not only an audio podcast, which it has been up to this point, but what do you think about doing a video component and maintaining the audio on your normal channels, but recording the video for our channel? And I love the idea, and this is the experiment that we're in right now. So thank you for all your feedback, and we really appreciate letting us know what you think about it. This week, the schedule is really packed. Raise Karma has a wide range of artists and creatives and teachers talking about a wide range of issues related to spirituality and the arts, and you probably already know that, but I recommend checking out all of those wonderful artists. My brother Ali Hussain is speaking about Arabic music. My sister Ahlam, who I go way back with in the Bay Area days, warehouse days, has a program. Ras Muhammad, shout out Ras Muhammad from Indonesia, reggae artist who is very talented. I'm a big fan of his work, and he has a channel. Abdul Karim Cedarberg, that is my brother, a master artist, traditional artist from Sweden, has a program. The Reminders, dope hip-hop duo that I've known for many years, and I could go on and on. All of these people are doing programs this month, weekly programs like myself, so I recommend you check it out. And each week there's a theme. Last week, as I mentioned, was about positive thoughts versus negative thoughts, and this week's theme is about embracing life. And each theme is really around the vices and the virtues of the spiritual heart, right? And reflecting on how to cultivate a healthy, sound heart that is luminous and able to reflect the divine light. And embracing life, the counter side of that, of course, or maybe we couldn't even call it the counter side, but the part of it that we don't always reflect on with such joy is embracing death. And death, of course, is a topic that we're all thinking about, most likely much more than we usually do, because this is a time in which we're confronted with our mortality in this global pandemic. And so we really reflect in this podcast with Micha Anderson on life and death and how to negotiate life in the face of death, and how to negotiate death in the face of life, and a number of reflections on mortality and things like that. And both him and I had essentially kind of brushes with death, kind of, near-death experiences, you could say, quite recently. So we get into our own kind of personal reflections on that. But yeah, man, Mike is a good brother, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. I want everybody to support Raise Karma and send love. Follow them on their social media. Follow them on YouTube and wherever you could find them. And feel free to comment, like, subscribe, all those good things. And if you want there to be more video podcasts, because right now this is just for this month, we're trying it out. But if you like it, give us thumbs up, comment, and feel free to support us on Patreon, patreon.com/pathandpresent, to make this a consistent and long-term thing. If you would like to do so, you can vote in that way. So wishing everybody love and light, and praying that everyone is safe and sound. One love. Alhamdulillah. So, man, it's good to have you, my old friend.
Nice to be here.
Alhamdulillah. It's interesting to think we connected around a decade ago.
Maybe longer.
Maybe longer.
I would say longer, dude.
And
it's 15 plus maybe.
I remember you were coming back from Indonesia, and I was introduced to you as a musician. You were playing guitar, bass, and but over the years we've connected on all these levels of art, music, spirituality, psychology, the spiritual journey, the work within different communities around spirituality, psychology, wellness, community. So I'm very happy to have you. And I've actually never sat down with you and asked you kind of your journey. I've just got bits and pieces, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we could just start, for those who are listening, because now, of course, you're a psychologist. You're someone who has a degree in transpersonal psychology. I'd love to get into what that is. You're someone who has worked in various communities, particularly in mind-body awareness with the juvenile hall and things like that, as well as done a lot of work in the Muslim community, Buddhist community, other spaces. So I'd love to just hear kind of what brought you to this very unique, eclectic journey that you're on. Yeah.
Long story. I'll try to give the lesser version of it. But, grew up in Connecticut, in the 70s and the 80s, and middle-class family, had what we needed. Only child, and by the time I was, hit my teen years, starting even at 12 or 13, I was already starting to kind of run with some kids in the neighborhood and get into some trouble, started dipping into, just crime and drug use, and, started wilding out at a pretty early age. And that's important for me to mention as a starting point, because by the time I was 16, I had already gone through several different placements and was clean and involved in Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous, which was one of the first seeds that I had for a concept of a higher power outside of the constrictions or confines of a religion, which was Christianity. So I was raised in that religion, not very strict, I'll say, but it was still it was a shift in my mind at that point, that there could be a power, like some people do, even in AA or NA, they didn't believe in God, but they believed in the higher power of the group, right? So they were able to kind of contextualize what a higher power was. And in one of the steps, the 11th step talks about prayer and meditation. So I started investigating meditation at that time, probably in my early, mid-teens, right, 16, 17 in there. And, by the time I was 25, I was, living in California, and I'd moved out there with some friends, and was doing quite a bit of Buddhist meditation practice at that point. So it really became my path in that regard, and then started traveling in Asia to do retreat practice in the mid to late 90s. And that was with some people in Santa Cruz. I know we wanted to maybe just touch on this. You know, there was a kind of came up in hip hop and punk rock movements and that kind of thing. And there was this interesting integration between spirituality and this kind of punk rock / irreverent take on spirituality, right? So we started kind of mixing the two a little bit. I was in Asia, traveled a couple times for several months at a clip with these friends, with this group, and we had ended up, there was a book that came out about it called Dharma Punks, and it was written by a friend, Noah Levine, who I was very close with at that time, and another friend, Vinny Ferrara, who I'm still teach with and still involved with. And it was in India where I started learning about Sufism. So I picked up some books while I was traveling over there, and there started to be a shift in my understanding of, Buddhism. It's not that it's atheistic. It just doesn't necessarily talk about God much, right? It's almost like a concept that's too big to even be discussed. And I felt like there was a missing kind of element for me in that, there was still a burned out framework from Christianity that I had, right? So I still did have a belief in a creator and God. So all of these different things started kind of coming together. There was like autobiography of Malcolm X, and there was hip hop growing up in the 90s in the tri-state area. And then there was, all these travels that I started taking around and learning about Sufism, and they all started coming together into this, I don't even know what to call it, right? Into this ethos in a way, right? That I was starting to learn and embody. And it wasn't shortly thereafter I converted to Islam in New York City at a masjid called Masjid Al-Farah, which is in Tribeca. Interestingly, one of the closest mosques to the World Trade Center. And this was before that, right? So I remember coming out on Thursday nights at 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning and, just staring up at the World Trade Center as I was walking back to my house or whatever in Manhattan at that time.
And that's the Jarahi order. That's another interesting chapter of kind of like spirituality coming west with Muzaffar Effendi and then Nur Lex Hickson founding that branch, more focused on the spiritual seeker as opposed to the other branch focused more on the traditional.
Yes,
Turkish way.
That's exactly it. Yeah, so it was the Nur Ashki Jarahis, which was a kind of a branch that came out of the Jarahis that, as you pointed out, they're a little bit more open in their interpretation of things. There was room for people who wanted to study traditional Islamic knowledge, and there was room for people who didn't. So it meant there was room for me because I didn't know what I wanted at that point, right? So it was really I've been bound to that order for the last 20 something years, ever since I walked into that place, and it's alhamdulillah, it's still there and going and doing its thing. So a lot of gratitude for them.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that kind of Dharma punks, and now that book has become so popular, and we've talked about this, that so much of us that came up, there's these interesting parallels between punk rock and hip hop in that era. And it's like the Dharma punks, and then there's the hip hop, Muslims, and like, what I mean? And like you kind of cross. But so many of like your close brothers, it was the Buddhist piece. But for you, that's interesting, like that, you experience in India, you experience Sufism in that Indian context, but it was that direction that pulled you as opposed to the others that kind of settled in Buddhism. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it was a strange time, right? Because I was kind of, as we do in our late teens and early 20s, we go through, we run through identities, right? And it's just like we're kind of looking to see like what fits, who am I, what is my belief system? How does my beliefs intersect with beliefs of, different theological beliefs? So it was a difficult period as well, right? Because I was very much in a Buddhist community, and then not suddenly, but over relatively quickly, I started kind of moving away from that. And keep in mind, this is back in the, again, the late 90s. So there weren't these kind of, paraliturgical spaces, semi-sacred spaces, places. It was, I didn't know much about Islam. I was self-identified as a Muslim long before I even prayed. And that was from hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
That was from hip hop completely, because, I was hearing all these Arabic terms, and and they were coming from the influences from the nation. They were coming from influences from Zulu nation. They were coming influences from the 5%ers, and navigating that also as a white male, right, from a middle class background, was also curious and complex. So I'm grateful for that experience, because I think it gave me a grounding in kind of explorations of what whiteness is in these types of contexts, what identity is. It was a confusing time, and I'm very much still in that process of trying to figure it out, because it's, once you get your hands on it, it kind of slips out sometimes, and then there's so.
Yeah, no, that's real, and I think that's almost like another conversation, but one that's really fascinating, because you're not alone, and I can say we're not alone in that similar trajectory of, obviously, hip hop in the 90s, especially early 90s, mid 90s, late 90s even. It's like this revival and this passing of that kind of like Black Muslim trajectories, those multiple trajectories that you point out, into popular culture all across the board. People in urban environments, suburban environments, middle class environments, and there's a wide range of like white Muslims today that trace their lineage through that trajectory. So but for you though, I'm curious how your spiritual journey then kind of leads into your career or your path as in psychology. So how does that happen? And I know that for those that don't know about transpersonal psychology and the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, Sophia, that's a very unique historical thing itself. So how you were drawn particularly to that kind of stream within the broader field of psychology.
Yeah. It's a very roundabout way that I got to it, right? So when I was in placements as a teenager, I remember there were a couple people, and I still remember their faces and names, who took me by the hand. They led me, right? They were there for me. They were empathic. They were trying to help me. They were trying to understand. And I remember thinking to myself, that's something I could do. Like I would probably be happy doing that. Like I would be content doing that. I would be fulfilled doing that. Now, keep in mind, by the time I was 19, I was, pretty much for that one decade was, playing in punk rock bands and, traveling in this, crashing on couches and the dervish kind of lifestyle, right? And that led me ultimately to have to work at some point. And I remember one time I was working at some job in San Francisco. I was a copy editor or something at a magazine. And I remember I was standing in the hallway one time and I was like, is this it? Like after all the travels I've done and all the digging I've done and, the archaeology I've done, right, in myself, this is what I'm going to settle for. Because I knew I wasn't fulfilled. There wasn't a purpose. There wasn't a meaning in that. Ended up traveling to Indonesia, and I lived there for 6 years. Had a child, got married, and it was a fantastic period of time. And at that time, I was like, I'm not content. This is not what I want or what I'm meant to do. And it was at that time I decided to go back to school. It was in my mid 30s. I went back, finished a bachelor's, and then went into what was then the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is now Sophia University, which interestingly was founded originally. The Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in the 70s was founded by one of the head leaders of the Jarahi order, right? Which was another connection there, right? And like you said, they have a fantastic history in the Bay Area of, providing training for psychologists and therapists through a transpersonal lens, which essentially is taking to account not only the physical and the mental, but it's also taking into account the unseen, taking into account the spirituality, beliefs, religion, transpersonal beyond the person, right? In a way, right? It's like, what else is there? What are the different layers? So I always appreciated that coming from a spiritual point of view, because I view spirituality as a major resource for myself and for my clients and my family and my friends. So it felt like a natural kind of progression to go in. Not that that's the only type of psychology I practice, right? But I'm very, very influenced by that and open to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, I've been fascinated by that school, and that I've known quite a few people that have gone through that trajectory. Also interested in this overlap of spirituality and psychology. I think you and I share this, and I think this is one of the most interesting manifestations of our era that we live, where we're in this kind of like secular, post-Christian, modern, postmodern, multicultural age in which people are very fast moving away from religion in the West. And there's some holdouts here in America that are different from Europe, but in the major urban centers, it's following a similar trajectory as Europe, where people are really discarding tradition by and large. And yet, as we know, and there's a lot of overlaps between your journey and mine, which I won't get into right now, but listeners to this podcast will have heard enough of that. But yet it is not in any way, you could say, we shouldn't mistake the turning away from quote unquote organized religion with the turning away from seeking meaning, seeking a deeper experience of existence, understanding our own consciousness, our own mind, or our own soul, you could even say, and its relation to something which transcends not only us, but maybe even the physical world itself. And, we are in the kind of psychological age where a lot of these great ancient traditions, wisdom traditions, are being kind of, you could say, mined for their spiritual and even maybe particularly psychological benefits.
No question.
Right? So as we, like interesting, you're teaching mindfulness in juvenile hall and in the adult prisons and in all these other settings, right?
Yeah.
And, we know that, yoga studios are on every corner in America. And we know that terms, have entered the lexicon, from enlightenment to nirvana to karma to even ideas of reincarnation. That's from the kind of like dharmic traditions. But even ideas of like a higher self and a lower self, and even in many circles, there's this kind of taking a very kind of almost like Sufi or Vedic kind of idea that like, okay, I came into this world to have these set of experiences. You have like, this is almost like a very common idea that people have, right? And so I think that's really interesting because it's almost like an experiment. It's like taken out of a traditional context and explored in the context with which we find ourselves. And I think you're not the only one. I feel myself also, and many of the people we know, but we're kind of all at this intersection of these spaces and really trying to,
that's right,
one, seek it for ourselves. Like, how do these profound traditions inform the way that I live and see the world? And then also, when you're in a kind of like service, when you're teaching or when you're leading meditations or groups, drawing these in for other people's in their journeys. So yeah, I guess I could just, leave it open like that. But I mean, how have you, felt that this kind of overlapping of the ancient and the modern, as far as Western psychology and its frames and its, methods, if you have any reflections just on navigating that space in your personal journey and also in kind of, holding space for other people?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think if we take, my two main paths have been Buddhism and Islam, right? Over the course of my life, and of course Christianity to a certain extent in the earlier years. Buddhism's been much easier to kind of pick and choose from, right? I think, than Islam particularly, and there's a lot of reasons. We could do in a whole hour just on that, right? But even the terms that you were using as you were explaining it, most of them were dharmic, right? So enlightenment, even higher self, like that starts to get into some Sufism stuff, right? But karma, these have entered, like you said, the lexicon of most people, right? I think the direction that I've gone in, particularly with my clinical work, meaning working with as a private, having a private practice as a psychotherapist, and also then, as you mentioned, doing work with incarcerated populations, youth and adults. Obviously, so you've got to cast kind of a wider net, right? Because you've got a lot of different types of people with varying levels of belief, varying levels of religiosity, all the way from atheist to full on, complete practicing Muslim or Buddhist or whatever. Or Christian or whatever it may be. So I think for me, navigating that has been important, particularly because with, for example, mindfulness, and this same goes for prayer, there's actually evidence-based, right? There's research now that holds up the idea that building self-awareness, for example, through either formal practice of mindfulness or informal practice of mindfulness, changes the brain and helps us to become more aware of our actions as we're doing them, right, in real time. Helps, and for me, it has aided things in like forgiveness, gratitude practice. These are the types of things that when we start to speak in universals, and that's really what I'm hearing you talk about, right? It's like people in this age are going for universals, right? Many people want to pick and choose and put their own thing together. And I spent years doing that myself, right? There's a great freedom in that. There's a great responsibility in that. And I think by leaning on that side of things with the populations I work with, I'm able to translate wisdom traditions into, this is really part of my life's work, right? Is how do you translate traditions to people who may not want to drink the full thing, right? They want a different flavor of it. Maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. And I think kind of just to transition, given that we're in this time of the coronavirus, as well as like deep unrest, like in our country, it's a profound time of uncertainty, anxiety, fear, anxiousness, and ultimately, like I think we're all forced to kind of confront our mortality in ways that can be deeply difficult, to put it lightly,
Yeah.
right? And I think, what's interesting is, these traditions that you talk about, one of the interesting things about them is that they don't shy away from death. And in fact, they focus on it, they hone in on it, and
That's right.
they encourage those walking these paths to sit with that, sit with their own mortality. And they seem to, in my studying of not only Islam, Buddhism, but all the Christianity for sure, and Hinduism, etc. There is definitely this idea that, in fact, in a deep engagement with death can allow you to live a fuller, more perfect, you could say, or more awakened life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about that. And I think even many people in our kind of modern age that are drawn to the spiritual path, it's through close encounters with death, whether it's a loved one, whether it's in their own near-death experience. It's something that shakes you and says, like, okay, I have to ask some deeper questions. What is this all about? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
So
trauma in a way.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear, your own kind of reflections on that, particularly around, your work and this present moment, and maybe even if it ties into your own journey, if you can resonate with that, anything you have.
It totally ties in with the journey, so in the the early 90s, I went through a series of traumas, loss of people in my life. There were some substantial deaths, family members that were close to me. And the very things that we usually put our finger on as real were no longer real anymore. They weren't there anymore, right? So there was a change in perception of what is real and what is not. And this is, I think, the questions that I started sitting with. Is just like, oh, like this whole thing could just crumble, right? Very similar to the experience I've had over the last 6 months, right? With all of the things that's happening. It's just like, oh, that delusion thing that I've been reading about for 25 years, right? Or everything's illusion, or there's elements of the unseen that we don't see. And oh, that's real. Like there was a kind of an experiential understanding of it. May have just been a drop in the ocean, but it was enough for me to wet my lips and get a taste of that. Is it difficult? Yes. Is it enmeshed with things like fear? Totally. But this is, to quote our master Jalaluddin Rumi, keep looking at that wound, because the wound is where the light enters you, right? So keep going towards what's difficult. What is it that I'm afraid to look at? That's usually a sign for me to go in that direction, right? Mortality, fear of death, fear of dying, grief, trauma. For me, these are the doorways to enter, to explore. And there's been personal experience. I was a victim of gun violence 6 months ago in my home. I was shot in my own home. I was hit by a stray bullet. So these types of things, right? It's like, can I look at this as something that's offered to me for me to understand myself better? and to understand, for me personally, my relationship with everything, with God, with my family, with my community, with myself. And this is what we, in psychological terms, we call this like post-traumatic growth, right? Everyone's heard of post-traumatic stress, right? When we go through a trauma, the nervous system will, start to show trauma exposure responses, right? That show up in the body, right? But this idea of resiliency and not only bouncing back, but bouncing forward, right? Are we able to actually take the difficulty, the struggles that we've been through, as horrific as they may have been, and actually use it as a stepping stone for change of myself ultimately? So that in there is like, I think maybe the key of the work that I want to do. I'm not saying I'm doing it well yet, but this is the direction that I see things going in. And death is, you could say in many ways, the ultimate trauma that we're all waiting for. Right?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on this. I feel like you're really getting at something really profound. And it's interesting, talk about words that have entered the lexicon. I hear more and more people just talking about trauma, people talking about healing, people talking about these terms of just really acknowledging this. And I think, that is one of the things that the spiritual traditions often will talk about too. And that I'm really curious and interested in is like, how can these difficult experiences we have actually bring us closer to the light and bring us closer to the truth and bring us closer to beauty and bring us, and in a certain sense, it's like the edge of vulnerability can lead down a couple paths. If you feel vulnerable, you can lash out and you can identify others as danger and threatening, right? And we all know on an individual level, but even on like a societal and geopolitical level, right? When people feel threatened economically and these type of things, that's when there's the danger of kind of radical populism and kind of, people who say they're going to come in and make it all right and blame it on the Jews or blame it on this group of people to scapegoat. And people are more likely to give up to those people because they feel scared ultimately, right? Because in fear you can make. But on the other hand, fear and difficult experiences can also lead people to a deeper state of empathy and being moved by the suffering of others and locating their suffering in themselves and making them more generous and more kind and more universal and seeing all beings in themselves ultimately, and then living according to that or starting to implement that. So I'm curious about that because it seems like such a fine line that it could turn either way, and I'm curious if you have some thoughts about that.
I think for me, one thing that's helped me in the practice of, we're talking about alchemy, right? We're talking about turning base or difficulty into something else, right? Faith is an important piece, and the ability for me to be the ability to hang in with discomfort and with difficulty in a non-reactive, non-blaming way, right? So there's a situation that's presented to me, it's uncomfortable. What's my first reaction? Is to pull out, to go within, not to engage, to disengage possibly, or the flip side of it, right? If you take the trauma, right, it's like fight or flight, right? We can pull out or we could go in harder, right? With our own set of, this is, like you said, this is the way it has to be. This is the way it is. So I've been very curious about like the uncertainty and certainty, and certainty of uncertainty. That's what I've been kind of sitting with. Like, can I just allow uncertainty to be at times? Can I allow myself to move into a direction that may be more uncomfortable for the time being? Because that's really what the work is, right? If we talk about quote unquote the work, right? The work on ourselves, our hearts, our own selves, it's not always pleasant and easy, right? If you think back, for me, I think back to the most transformative times in my life, they've been the most difficult. They weren't the times where it was easy and everything was, puppy dogs and sunshine, as they say, right? So I think that for me, there's something in that, right? There's this sacred heart of trauma. There's this piece in there that's, it's very hard to even put words to, right? But I think that there's an alchemy that can happen through a lot of different practices, through prayer, through meditation, through community, right? Through conversation, through maybe even deeper therapeutic interventions that I believe in and use, and that I've used on myself and with clients as well, right? And I think that's where the intersection starts to come between psychology and spirituality, right? Is kind of looking at, okay, how do we take, on one hand, psychological traditions that are evidence-based, right, that are modern, and also capture deeper elements of some of the things that we've been discussing that are prevalent in wisdom traditions like Islam or Buddhism or these types of things. But coming back to the mortality piece, that's the biggest one, right? That's the biggest one. And I think a lot of the work, I did a class called A Year to Live, and it's from a book by Stephen Levine. And it's essentially a year-long practice, right? If you had 1 year to live, what kind of unfinished business would you finish up, right? And it's not like, I'd move to a desert island and, whatever, you go do some, it's not about that. It's about like unfinished business. It's like, what am I still holding on to, right? What is my relationship to forgiveness? What is my relationship to fear about death, right? And how do I start to work with that fear and maybe reduce it? Because we can reduce that fear through closeness to it, right? And our tradition speaks of this, right? The more that this is why we teach my kids. It's like, I've got little kids, man. It's like, be aware. Time is fleeting. The clock is ticking, right? And do we, the royal we, have time to postpone anymore? That's really what A Year to Live practice is about, is looking at what have we postponed? What do we keep postponing? I'll talk to him later. I'll tell mom I love her next time. Right? Whatever it may be, right? These things that I'll do that thing. I'll learn how to play guitar next year. I'll read that book right? Just put it, postpone. And how do we start to kind of have a more embodied, integrated experience of life that's joyful and healing at the same time? I think that's something in there.
Yeah, we've discussed this Year to Live, and I think, some of the practices in there, really powerful, like writing a will, writing letters to people that you feel like you really, you've harmed or you've been harmed by, and you never reconciled, even if you don't send them, but just to write it. That's right. Know what I mean?
That's right.
Things like that are really profound. And, that's, there's that kind of maxim is, the problem is you think you have time. And we all think we have time, even in the Sufi tradition, as one of the kind of like faults on the spiritual path is what they call long hopes, right? I have time, I have time. It really, that's the fault. It's just to think, to essentially not be living how you should live, under some false premise that like one day I'll be who I would like to be. And, you know, just to like bring my own personal experience in, you know, as you know, you know, at the beginning of this kind of coronavirus thing, I basically came down with the symptoms of it, you know, and what it happened right at the beginning of it. And so it was almost like, at first I was like, am I just like, you know, because it's the collective consciousness, am I just freaking out? Is it like the psychosomatic thing? Because it was really when everyone started really freaking out and it was just before everything kind of locked down. I started feeling like a fever and like, I was like, come on, not really. But sure enough, like I had the symptoms and at first it was like just weakness, but then after a few days it became this shortness of breath. And, you know, the first night of that, I was not sure I was going to live because I was like, I can breathe right now, but not very well. I feel like my lungs are being squeezed. And if this gets worse, I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, and what was interesting is like the deep, almost like biological responses that like I had no control over. Like my body just went into that kind of like fight or flight, like all this kind of like fear just flowing through me in a way that I was like, and you know, the thing was that the next day I woke up and my lungs felt better. I was still super weak, right? I felt like a very like old man, like very weak. But essentially that came and went in waves for 2 months. And so, and I would get better. Like I would have a few days of that and then I would get like very much better. And I thought I'm in the clear, and then it would come back.
Yeah.
And so this started to have like this deeply psychological effect on me of like lack of, you could say, not trust in a divine sense, but, you know, like my usual, you know, like if I get sick or I get the flu, it's like, yeah, I go down and then I get better, you know, but like to have it come back and keep going, it kept me, you know, even though like that was 2 months ago now that I've been like better, I still feel myself like worried. Like, do I have a fever? You know what I mean? Like I'm in this, like it's deeply traumatic, like, you know, and I still feel myself kind of negotiating and navigating, and don't by any means think that I'm like out of it. Like I think it's a process. But, you know, it was really profound too, because it was also one of these, like, you really have to go within, because the doctors were just like, we don't know what to do. Nobody knows. It's so early. Yeah. And all these different reports coming out, like a new death here, you know, look at the rates and people's hearts are stopping and previously healthy people are dying everywhere. And it's just like, okay, you know, this is what it is right now. Like I have to sit in this moment and it's okay right now. I can breathe right now. Maybe, you know, maybe I feel deeply constricted in my breathing, but I can breathe, you know? And I honestly feel that like, you know, it's going to take me years actually, if I'm given that long to, you know, really process this experience. And I feel like everyone, whether they, you know, have the symptoms or not, everyone is going through their own feeling of, you know, it's this feeling of like the given, what you trust in is taken away. Like the rug is taken under your feet. So now it's like, what do I have to rely on? What do I have to turn to? You know, I remember when I was sick for all this time, looking out the window and, you know, seeing people below, you know, just walk on the street or, you know, hug their loved ones. And I was like, if I get to do that, I would be eternally happy. Just those simple things that we take for granted, that I took for granted before. Just that people were playing sports or, you know what I mean? Like just having a good time in a very simple way.
And even in that, there's still the desire to be someplace else. Right? So it's like, and if we're that person, I know for me, if I'm walking down the street playing with my kids, it's going to be like, yeah, this is cool, but if the weather was a little bit better, or if the frisbee, if I didn't forget the frisbee at home, or if, you know, we're flying a kite and it's like the wind's not, there's, right? It's just this idea that we're always looking for something that's wrong to get out of this moment that we're in, right? So I think you named it when you were talking. The antidote to that, but one of them is gratitude. It's just like, can I just be okay with what things are right now? Right now, granted, it's a lot harder to be okay when your lungs feel like they're collapsing, or you just had a bullet that went through your leg, right? It's a little bit harder to do that work, but we do the work. See, this is the important part, is like doing that work when things are actually okay. We don't start to do the work when the ship sails into the fan. It's going to be of less help to us at that time, right? But we start to program, and it happens in the brain. Like I said, neuroplasticity will start to happen. The brain will start to change itself and start to create new neural pathways that help us in resiliency, right? But we've got to do the work ahead of time. This is why prayer, meditation as regular practices, they can really greatly aid us, right? Not that they're the silver bullet to everything, right? Because we know that there's plenty of people who pray and meditate and they don't get a whole lot from it, right? So I think it's, I'll pause on that.
But just that degree of like, there's in all these, these spiritual traditions, there's this idea of kind of like letting go your self-directedness and having a degree of like, maybe, the word faith or the word trust.
Surrender, possibly.
Surrender, really. I mean, Islam itself, right? It like but really there's this theme of like letting go of your personal desire to control, that it turns out a specific way, that you're in charge, right? And like on the, and there's many levels of it, like to let go on that foundational level of life itself. But this beautiful promise of all these traditions, and particularly of the great, like, saints and sages and prophets of those traditions who have kind of like gone through the dark night of the soul, gone through the 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, gone through the, the struggles and the trials and tribulations, and come out with this message of like, the light is holding this all, and the wisdom and truth is holding this all, and there's a way to live more fully and more beautifully and more in line with the all.
Yeah, they come out more whole, you could say, right? This concept of anti-fragility, right, also kind of relates to that, right? So you've got like fragile, something drops on it and it smashes. You've got resilient, something drops on it and it bounces off, or it doesn't break, it just kind of lands. And then you've got anti-fragility, where something lands on it, it smashes, but then something new and better is rebuilt from it. Right? So this is very much related to that idea of like post-traumatic growth. And I think it relates exactly to the traditions, the narratives, the stories of many of these wisdom traditions and the people that we look up to, right? Even modern day saints and sages have gone through their own, right, trials, tribulations, struggles, Malcolm X, whatever, right? It's just like the first one that popped into my mind, right? But again, post-traumatic growth took the prison experience as a way to sharpen the sword ultimately when he came out. And my work in jails is very much aligned in that, right? That work, trying to just have conversations with people and offer some light guidance on how to do that when people are ready for it, right?
So in your work with that, with all these settings, but particularly to go back to what you mentioned about a year to live, what, I'm just curious, like people that come out of a program like that, just any reflections you have on either doing it yourself or then facilitating that journey for others, and any kind of insights you have that you feel people walk away with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep thing because it's a cohort for a year, right? So it's like we'll meet every month for 3 hours for 1 year, right? No ins, no outs. It's like you can't join a month 2, you can't join a month 3, right? Of course, people dip down because life happens. A friend of mine's actually running one now, and people go through stuff, man. People, dip out, and traumas happen, and lives are lost, even within the cohorts, right, of these groups. So I think, again, the it's oriented towards getting more comfortable through experience for ultimately our death, whether that's getting more comfortable, getting more aware and comfortable with our fear of death. Is a fear of death, is a fear of dying. They're different. They're not the same, right? Some people don't have fear of death, but they have fear of dying. They have fear of pain. They have fear of grief, right? Fear of leaving people behind, right? So like starting to kind of parse all those apart so that we can have inquiries into each one. It's just like, okay, what does this one mean to me? Why is this one there? Why is there a fear of dying, but not so much of a fear of death? Okay, what does that mean? Right? Maybe it's more work on working on discomfort and holding discomfort and being with discomfort. Maybe it's more forgiveness work. Maybe it's more gratitude practice. Maybe it is just starting to like talk about death and get closer to the idea of death and to understand it more, right? The thing that our very society teaches us: postpone it. Don't worry about it. It's eternal. Just shop, do your thing, get your money, work your job. But it keeps us veiled from ultimately what could be very close, right? So what type of works are we doing to prepare for that? I think is really the context of Year to Live. It's really a preparation in a lot of ways. And the people coming out of it, I mean, there's been all kinds of amazing things that have come out of it. I mean, there's of course a real connection and closeness with the cohort because we're diving into pretty deep topics, right? So people getting real. There's a lot of trust that's that's very important in these types of groups, right? Vulnerability, authenticity, and it's cliche to say, but these are the kind of things. The more you show up and the more you put into it, the more you're ultimately going to leave with, right? But I think a greater sense of self, a more embodiment of like who I want to be, right? How do I want to show up in this world with the as the clock is ticking? It's like, who am I? And am I showing up really in a congruent way with who myself is? But the problem is most people, including myself, often don't know who the self is. So how do you learn how to integrate that if you don't even know what that is, right?
Yeah, no, that's it. And like you said, it's to do this work, it's really profound, the kind of just the framing of a year to live. It's like if you were given notice, you were given a diagnosis, say.
That's actually how it starts. The first month, we actually do a prognosis, right? It's just like, okay, you've got 1 year. And we talk about that and we kind of process that. And it's just like, and then each month we'll have like maybe a different lens or different kind of approach. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but that's exactly how we started, right? So it really lowers you into it. It's like, oh, okay, where do I want to take this year, right? What are the things that are important to me? Yeah, man.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, I often think about the fact like life would have such a different meaning. And in fact, it's hard to even imagine what life would mean or what it would be if we didn't die. You know, I mean, it's like it's the backdrop of this whole thing, you know. But the idea of preparation, like you said, you know, it's hard, you know, if you don't learn martial arts when you get in a street fight. Like if you haven't been preparing for this moment, it's gonna be difficult, right? So it's like it's hard to have that meditative, you know, prayer-based practice of submission and trust and all that stuff if you haven't been cultivating it when the virus hits.
Easier.
You know.
When it's ultimately easier to cultivate, right? Yeah. I think that's where the laziness comes in and the postponement, like you were saying. Yeah, I got time. I'm young, right? That's the kind of stuff you work on when I'm in my rocking chair, man. You know, after I did all my life's work, right? My imaginary 80-year-old self sitting on my rocking chair. And it's like, that's a complete story. I have there's absolutely no truth to that, right? Could happen, but we bank on it. Retirement. And again, having that balanced with making sure that we're not spiritually bypassing, right? Because I also live here in this world. I'm here, right? I have family, I have people, I have a job, I have responsibilities, right? So I think there's a very fine line, and we see that a lot in most religious and spiritual communities, right? There's a very easy way to just be like, I'm gonna just be over here praying, doing my thing, right? That's all of the world, that's all dunya, that's all suffering, it's all delusion. And it's like, yeah, but I'm also here. Right. So I just wanted to name that. I think that's for me some of the hardest work actually, is discerning between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ideally this practice of, I mean, you know, if you think about the 5 times daily prayer, I mean, really what it is it's like the dress rehearsal for standing in the divine presence on the day of rising. I mean, 5 times a day, just to remind you, right? It's a reminder of the perishing nature of this world.
Yep.
And, you know, I think best case scenario, right, that these spiritual practices, they allow you to then actually approach the dunya, right, Maya, the illusion, with a beautiful sense of grace and trust and selflessness and virtue, and not losing sight of the perishing nature of it all, but actually in a certain sense perhaps even savoring more and enjoying more deeply the transient experiences, the taste of that peach.
That's right. There you go.
You know, the embrace of that loved one.
That's right.
That, you know, that is the state that you kind of hear about of the Buddha, or, you know, the prophet, or, you know, they've achieved that state. It's like going through death and coming back did not diminish them, right? It expanded them. And, you know, may we walk those paths.
It reminds me of one of my teachers says the preciousness is in the impermanence. All right. Like you were, you know, just contemplating about before, what would life be like if there was no death? I wonder how precious it would be if you knew that this was just going to go and go. Right. So I think that there's something really in that. That's the alchemy piece, right? Is just really dialing in on that alone will be a life's work.
I love that. That's the name of the episode. The preciousness is in the impermanence. Alhamdulillah, thank you, man. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's
And
been a pleasure. It's all too short as we imagined it would be.
where can if people want to follow up with you or your work, where is there a place that people can find you?
Yeah. I mean, I've got just a personal website. It's just michaandersontherapy.com. There's the organization I work for currently that I run Mind Body Awareness Project. It's mbaproject.org. That's our work with incarcerated populations. And then, of course, I'm kind of a wandering Ronin. I go to different communities and do stuff. So Wasat, and, in Seattle and Center DC, and work in the UK. And I've had the honor of working with a lot of different places. Tetleaf, of course. But right now have a private practice and MBA are the two main things. So.
Alhamdulillah. Beautiful. All right.
It's such a good feeling to know that you're alive. It's such a happy feeling. You're growing inside. And when you wake up ready to say, I think I'll make a snappy new day. It's such a good feeling, a wonderful feeling. A feeling that I'll be back when the day is new, and I'll have more ideas for you, and you'll have things you'll want to talk about. I will too. Peace and welcome. I'm Danny Darling, and this is The Violet Life. I'm coming to you with Raise Karma. We are a project and collective of artists, musicians, dreamers, thinkers, believers, theologians, and we've come together during this pandemic on this multimedia platform to address some ideas that we think are important. It's often when we are faced with the greatest challenges that we have the greatest opportunities to elevate and raise our karma. And so this week we will be addressing the fear of death. So when it comes to tackling the theme of fear of death, it's one of the harder themes because right now it may feel like death is right around the corner. There's a global pandemic. It's highly contagious. There's no vaccine. That's scary. And even now in the United States, as a minority, it's hard not to think about your mortality when you see other people get gunned down or smothered or tortured because of the color of their skin. Either way, the concept of our temporary life here can be very unsettling. Now, I'd like to explore all of the different interpretations of what happens after we die, how people feel about it, and how people express that. I think that it's one of the deeper themes, but it's one of the more rewarding themes when we put that to art, right? When we confront death when it comes to our artistry or creativity, a lot of times that's when the magic happens. There's a song that I'm going to sing called I Will Follow You Into the Dark, and it's a narrative song about a kid that obviously went to Catholic school, obviously decided that wasn't for him, and has kind of been out in limbo or purgatory, if you will, pun intended, But this song addresses the concept of not knowing what happens after death, but wanting that companionship in death. And that's something that a lot of people think of, like the fear of dying alone is what's really the most scary part of death. You know, as a triplet, I came into this world with 2 other gals, but it's unlikely that I'll go out with both of them. So that is a particularly scary thought. And while we can't decide how we go out, it is a nice thought to think about having someone there with you.
Love of mine, someday you will die, but I'll be close behind. I'll follow you into the dark. No blinding light or tunnels to gates of light, just our hands clasped so tight, waiting for a hint of a spark. If heaven had a sign that they both are satisfied, illuminate the notes on their vacancy sides. If there's no one beside you when your soul embarks, then I will follow you into the dark. Catholic school, as vicious as golden rule, I got my knuckles bruised by a lady in black. I held my tongue as she told me, hun, fear is the heart of love. So I never went back. If heaven had a sign that they both are satisfied, illuminate the notes on their vacancy sides. If there's no one beside you when your soul embarks, then I will follow you into the dark. You and me have seen everything to see, from Bangkok to Calgary, and the soles of your shoes are all torn down. The time for sleep is now. It's nothing to cry about, 'cause we'll hold each other soon. If heaven had a sign that they both are satisfied, illuminate the notes on your vacancy sides. If there's no one beside you when your soul embarks, then I will follow you into the dark. And I will follow you into the dark.
Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, when it comes to seeking advice, I always say ask people who came before you, who know better than you. And so when it comes to me, I think of the ancestors. My ancestors are Black Americans brought over on the transatlantic trade from Western Africa. And it's interesting to look at the concept of death for Black Americans and how it evolved. You know, when it comes to African spirituality or the belief systems that we had in place before we came to the United States, it was a very different concept of death. In fact, discussing death or even acknowledging it as an end was frowned on and discouraged, and still is in many faiths that aren't centered around Christianity or Islam. It's very, very common when it comes to tribal spiritual practices that the ancestors are who we look to for guidance, that death is not something to be sad about, but something to be celebrated, that there's no waiting period, there's no final judgment. There's just an ascension as soon as you die, if you've earned it, to become an ancestor and to dwell in a better place or in some other plane or existence, but able to still interact with the world. Now, when slaves came over to the United States that changed a bit. We were introduced to Christianity, the concept of death, whether it was for the purposes of controlling humans or whether it was in earnest belief. We were led to believe that although our lives would not be what we deserved this go round, that there was a better place on the horizon, that after death there would be some kind of reward, that we would see Jesus, that we would be absolved and finally at peace. And I think a lot of slaves really leaned into that. If you look at the African spiritual, it's a lot of looking forward to heaven, looking towards that afterlife, because there's no hope for the life that we're in, right? So when it comes to the ancestors, you have that dichotomy. If you look at funerals in New Orleans, you have these sacred songs, hymns even, but then you have these marching bands and people dancing, and there's a tune and a jig to it, like when the saints go marching in, and it's like, well, the sadness is still there and the devastation in the mourning, but then there's still that residual celebration aspect from our African spirituality and our ancestors that tell us this is not the end. So there's still that optimism. This next song is actually a spiritual. It's called All My Trials.
If religion was a thing that money could buy, the rich would live and the poor would die. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brothers, too late, but never mind. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. Now hush, little baby, don't you cry. You know that man was born to die. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. Too late, my brothers, too late, but never mind. All my trials, Lord, soon be over. All my trials, Lord, soon be over.
Some people take an intuitive approach to death, and where sacred texts or mythology help to nurture those thoughts of what happens to us after we die. They rely on their own spirituality, and many rely on dreams, on visions, etc. I think I am not alone when I say that I've had thoughts or I've had dreams about an afterlife, or where I saw someone I loved that passed on. They say that when you're in your deepest phase of unconscious, when you're in the deepest sleep, you're so close to death, your breathing slows, your heart rate drops down, and that's when you're able to kind of see beyond. So dreams are very important. This song Pyramid is based off a dream, and I think it's really interesting to look at how your dreams can form your concept of death and how that can affect your creativity.
Jumped in the river, what did I see? Black-eyed angels swam with me in a room full of stars and astro cars, and all the figures I used to see. All my lovers were there with me. All my past and future. And we all went to heaven in a little rowboat. There was nothing to fear, nothing to doubt. Jumped into the river. Black-eyed angels swam with me in a room full of stars and astro cars, and all the figures I used to see. All my lovers were there with me. All my past and future. And we all went to heaven in a little rowboat. There was nothing to fear, nothing to doubt. I was screaming into the canyon. The moment of my death, the echo I created, I lasted my last breath. I have only one thing to do, and that's be the wave that I am and just sink back into the ocean. I have only one thing to do, and that's be the wave that I am and just sink back into the ocean. sink back into the ocean. Chakras originated as early as 1500 BC in India. It was written about in the Vedas, one of the oldest written texts. And chakra is Sanskrit for wheel. It represents the center of our spiritual being. And if you think of those centers, which are all throughout your body in different placements, it's the center of your power, the center of your physical, spiritual, mental energy. The chakras are meant to be aligned and open. They each have a foundation. They each have a purpose. And so when it comes to a fear of death, I started thinking, which chakra would really help with that particular disease of the heart? And while all of them are actually quite appropriate for that particular theme, I thought that the sacral chakra, or the Svadhisthana, was particularly helpful because when you don't know an answer to something, or when you do have an answer to something, but it's all based on faith, on the unknown, or something unspoken that you can't really convey to someone else unless they believe too, then creativity or art is a really good way to kind of explore those themes of death and the afterlife. I think that when it comes to the unknowable, to the unforeseeable future, to explore those themes is really important. So I thought the sacral chakra was really important. The Svadhisthana, or the sacral chakra, is the second chakra. It is located right below your navel. Its color is orange. Its element is water. Its stone is carnelian. Its letter is Vam. So when you meditate, you want to get into your meditative state and you draw out the letter as you meditate and focus your breathing on that. Vam. Very good. It may feel silly at first, but the sacral chakra is all about creativity, about vitality, your sense of self, your sensuality and sexuality. And that's why I thought it was appropriate when it comes to a fear of death, because really procreating and that urge to do so is the opposite of the end of life or death. So I thought that it was important to explore the concepts that really go into our minds and our spirits when we go to procreate or we go to advance humanity. And so when it comes to the sacral chakra, the letter A is the tone that activates and charges that chakra. I'm going to play that note for you. And while you do so, take the meditative position. Take those deep breaths. In for 4, out for 4. Practice your syllables. Vam. As I play the note A. In for 4, out for 4.
Whether you are okay with accepting or acknowledging that you may not know what happens when we pass on, or if you have the utmost faith in Allah and believe that you will meet him up in heaven, or if you believe that Christ will rapture the church, or if you believe in past lives or future lives, reincarnation. The point is that whatever you believe, make sure that you live the life that you want to be living. Make sure that you live a life that you're proud of. That when you are done, if you do meet God, if you do meet Allah, if you see Jesus Christ, if you see Muhammad, if you see your great-great-grandparents or your ancestors, that you are proud of what you were able to accomplish in this life. And that when you do become afraid that this life may be over, that you remember that the show must go on.
Words are flying out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither wildly as they slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through my open mind, possessing and caressing me. Jakuru Deva. Nothing's gonna change my world. 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 Images of broken life which dance before me like a million nights. They call me on and on across the universe. Thoughts meander like a restless wind inside a letterbox. They tumble blindly as they make their way across the universe. Jakuru Deva. Nothing's gonna change my world. 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 Sounds of laughter, shades of light are ringing through my open ears, inciting and inviting me. Limitless, undying love which shines around me like a million suns and calls me on and on across the universe. Jakuru Deva. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world.
So welcome, it's Tuesday at 7, we are live, digging deeper, and with me I have the wonderful Professor Tracy Curry.
Aww.
I'm so excited to have you.
Okay, so you're gonna have to say Tracy. This is all.
But I just feel like out of respect, I gotta say that.
I received that. So then that means you're Professor T.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, there you go.
But now we can drop the formality.
Okay,
That was just, introductions. Just gotta let people know that, okay.
Okay, now that you know, okay.
Now that you know. So we've got a really great topic today. We are talking about creating spirit spaces and honesty in expressions. So there's lots to unpack, lots to dig deeper. But before we do that, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
About myself. Okay.
I always have to put everyone in that awkward position where you're like,
right.
Tell us about yourself. But yeah.
So I'm Tracy. I'm gonna actually go all in. I am Tracy Evadne Curry. I don't ever really say my whole name, but it feels good because this past weekend I was away for, so I'm really going to talk about myself, but I have to go back a little bit but to say that I was at a spiritual retreat in Chicago. It was awesome. It was awesome. But in the process, I learned a lot about myself, about connecting with my family more. I came back, I realized that I need to put some practices in place for me to kind of reach to the next level of what I want to do in life, and that has a lot to do with my 14 years of being here and then deciding to make a change at the end of this semester.
You mean in Flint?
Here in Flint, yes, here in Flint. And so I say all that to say that I say my full name, Tracy Evadne Curry, because I'm honoring also my grandmother, who I'm named after. So we both have Evadne. And I usually don't say the name under the notion that people will say, what? Huh? Yeah. How do you spell it? So Evadne. And so it's just a blessing to know that I am named after this being.
I love that.
Yeah. And then it also honors her presence. I believe that she's here, so that's a good thing. Other quick things about me: that I was born in Chicago. I identify as Jamaican American. My family's from Jamaica. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware. Did all of that, and then did a lot of my schooling in the South and also in the Midwest. I've been here teaching for 14 years at University of Michigan Flint. I felt like that was such a long title.
It is.
Yeah.
University of Michigan.
Right. There you go. And so I've done that for 14 years. And so I made the clear and intentional decision to do something else in my life. So after this semester, I will head to the East Coast and see what else my heart, my spirit, my mind, my body can do. So
we're sad to see you go, but it's part of your journey, so I can't stop you. I gotta support you.
Yes. I need all my people to hear that.
Sometimes, we can't be selfish. We have to let go and let people experience what they need to experience.
That's it. And I did a quick reflection the other day, and someone made me realize that this essentially was my first, whatever they call real job, whatever that is, the so-called first real job after I finished the degree. And so even though I spent a year teaching in the Midwest in Ohio where I went to school, this job I came to thinking I was only going to be here for about 2-3 years.
And then you ended up staying for that.
I ended up staying for 14 years, and so this is like that first job, and I'm just like, okay. And generationally, my family would say that there was a time whereas you would have a job, have a career, and that would be your career for life.
Yeah.
It's like times have changed. Nope.
Like, you know what? I think 14 years was a good run.
It's great.
Now I'm ready for the next one.
I'm so ready. I'm blessed, ready, and I'm thankful. Yeah.
What can you tell us what you teach?
Yes,
what you've been teaching?
I was hired in the communication department. At the time, it was communication and visual arts, and I was hired in to teach production courses. So, funny enough, I was the person who did, what did I do? I did the video, audio, post-production. Did that for a period of time. They realized, she could do a few more things. So I also they piled it on a little bit. So I taught public speaking, media studies, film courses. And then the funny thing is, this is where my world was good, But my world opened up in 2007 when I created the spoken word course. And at that point, I was like, wow, life is really, now it's about to begin. It's on and popping. And I mean, I could arguably say that's what the research is in. That's what my dissertation's on. But spoken word, I believe words are transformative and they change lives. So that course has opened me up. It has.
And so you've been teaching that since 2007?
I have been teaching that since 2007. Wow. Yeah. And so last year I did this whole like decade celebration. The past 3 or 4 years, wonderfully, the Flint Public Library would allow us to host, they would host the course, the final performance at the library. And so I just kind of did this decade run, like we were doing it big, not knowing that I would teach the class again this year, but I'm teaching the class this year. And
11 years.
11 years. We're going to celebrate hard, right? So it's going to be good. It's going to be exciting.
That is exciting.
And it's a good group. They're pushing me. They're pushing me in ways that I'm just like, you all are not playing.
Students do that.
Yes. They're supposed to.
They're supposed to. It's a learning experience on both ends.
Yeah. They're my teachers. I think that's the one thing that I'm learning about teaching is that we act like we have all of this knowledge base and it stops in this body. And I'm just like, no, my students are my teachers. They're hardcore. They're awesome. Yeah.
And they force you to research other things.
Ooh, yes, they
do. They remind you of what you don't know.
Yeah. And the older I get, the more I realize I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm okay with that. Like I'm okay with saying that I feel like I run into, I'm going to say academicians, pontificators. I run into people who and nothing's wrong with these names. So I'm not making fun, but I kind of am making fun. But I run into sometimes people who the older you get, the more knowledge you get, and then you become what feels like, I don't want to say the word elders, because I see the word elder in a very different light, but for all intents and purposes, for the fact that I can't come up with a word right now, they become like this
oracle of knowledge.
This oracle of knowledge. Thank you. Yes. And I'm just like, no. Yeah. We keep learning. We continue to learn. Yeah, we continue to learn. So
we continue to learn. And I think it's interesting too, because I feel like in my field, many of the women that I work with have this perspective, but the men that are in this same field are like, no, I do know. And I'm like, that's a whole nother conversation to be had. But,
I'll come back for that one.
That'll be a whole topic on its own.
But yeah, that's interesting.
We'll dig deep about that, yeah. So we are doing today spirit spaces. You have your Instagram, and you document this. Can you tell us a little bit about what?
I can.
How did you come up with this?
So that's exciting.
And what is it?
Okay, so Spirit Space. So this is when I get a chance and an opportunity to celebrate and honor the people who are in my circle. Spirit Space has got to be about, I'm going to say about 3, maybe 4 years. No, I'm going to go with 3 years. And then if one of my besties is watching, then she'll say no. She'll chime in. Right. So Ayana, she's the person who helped me with this. We were talking through this, and she said, Tracy, you like to take photographs. That's like your thing. And I would carry my camera with me everywhere. Yeah. And she said, why don't you, she said,
document.
Right. She said, photographs is your thing and storytelling is your thing. So why don't you bring that together? And at the time I'm going to say I'm always exploring spirituality, but particularly at this time, I was really exploring and understanding what people see as their own spirituality. And so she said, take those pictures and allow people to create stories. So the way it was set up was that I'm the one who has to take the picture. Okay. And that allows me to build my skills as a photographer. And I use that title very loosely. Like, I don't want any professional photographers coming after me and saying, her F1 is off or something like that.
To capture moments and images. And
Right, exactly. And so my job would be to take the pictures and and I would take a lot of pictures of whomever I would ask to be the guest feature for Spirit Space, and then they choose whatever picture works. If they don't like it, we'll just go back in and we'll take more pictures. So that's a big thing. And then they actually create the story. And I would say my main question is, how do you see Spirit Space? What do you see as spirituality? What does that look like to you? And I'm not necessarily looking for them to specifically hone in on a religion. It could be, spirituality is broad. Spirit is broad. So I have a few where, spirit is their children. Spirit is the places that they go. Spirit is meditation. Spirit is trees. And I have one who's just like, spirit is all about eating food. I have another one who, and particularly, I've come in and out. Some I've taken out with the idea that I'm going to go back and redo some of those pictures. But I remember specifically a friend who wonderfully is the one who produced the CD that I did. She does woodwork, Enos. She does a lot of woodwork, and she's out of Detroit, and it's beautiful work. And so what I did is I took pictures of her doing that work and doing her clothing line, and she does music, and I was just like, that's her spirit space. And so it allows me to capture whatever image, capture them in a moment, and then have them choose, and then allow them to share their story, whatever that looks like, and then I upload. Now the funny thing is that has transitioned over. I am talking a mile a minute.
No, you're good. You're good because we have an hour, so get as much in as you can.
Okay, so the funny thing is that over time that has changed. So I'm actually in some of those pictures, right? Which means that unless I'm taking a selfie, which I'm usually not, someone else is taking the picture. And so what I had to do is I had to shift from always being behind the camera and to be a part of those pictures. I think that started to change when one of them was the year I turned 40. Okay. So I did this whole, this is Tracy in all her light over a period of time. And so I have about 6 pictures where I had locks that I rocked for about 18 years. Short locks, red locks, all kinds of locks, afro, twists, right. So I've done all hairstyles, glasses, no glasses, in different places. One was in Italy, another one was, so I did that to take a good look at myself, because the one thing I've had to work on over the years is my image. Feeling comfortable, feeling confident, being okay with my nose looking this way, my lips looking this way. It's great when friends, family, and people say that you're beautiful, but if you don't consider yourself beautiful, doesn't matter what anybody says.
Doesn't matter how many times they say it.
Doesn't matter how many times they say it. So I took those pictures specifically for myself, as if to say, this. Take a look at yourself. Take a good look at what God created. Yeah. This is you. And all your full glory, and it changes. And I think because of that, it's allowed me to be okay with getting older, because I feel like I come out of a family and I come out of friendships, and I come out of circles that make it okay to get older. Actually, the older you get, the better you get. Yeah. Which is why I watch TV way less, because you turn on the television, you see those commercials, and you see like all kinds of things. They sell you everything that reminds you what your age is, and that it's not okay to get older. And so I'm good on that. Like I need my circle to be tight, whereas having gray hair, which by the way I'm excited about my 2 gray hairs. That I have 2, and I know people may not see it, but
you see this guy?
Rocking it sexy, right? Like gray hair is a good thing.
And I mean, now young people are doing it too. You see all these people dyeing their hair gray.
And I'm just like, no. But
you didn't get there yet. So let's
reel it back.
Reel it back in.
Right. But I did have a friend who said, I see how excited you are, Tracy. Just, chill out. It's going to bring all its friends in due time. So yeah, I think older, it's a little bit of both, and just being excited to own myself right here, right now, and being mindful of the present.
So what is spirit to you then?
So after I said all So spirit is, let me see. Spirit is, Spirit starts on the inside and it is manifested outward. So I felt like I did a description instead of a working definition. So as we progress, I feel like we're going to come up with a lot of definitions. But spirituality or spirit for me is the inside of who I am. I used to say this all day long. I feel like I shouldn't confess this, but I used to say,
You're already there.
Right, on TV. Right. Oh, so I used to say that when people like me or crush or whatever the case may be, that they've got to be, now this is during my, I'm going to go with insecure days, but they've got to be falling in love on the inside, right?
Yeah.
And at some point, the outside, like this is really awful because this story is going downhill.
You know what? It's fine. We're just.
But let's go with this. So here we
That's how you go deep.
Right. So this is how we're gonna
too.
go deep. There you go. Excellent. So I used to say that the person who likes me or falls in love, they fall in love with the inside of me, and then all of that they see on the outside is manifested. The inside of me is always is spirit, right? Like I have, and I do believe this now, is that I happen to believe that people, and we put this in the context of partnerships and companions, but I believe that people, friends, family, best friends, mom, dad, that they fall in love with the inside of me, like who Tracy is. So when people describe, I mean, I guess they can say she's 5'3", hairy legs, you know, all that stuff. But I'm thinking when they say who is Tracy, we don't go for a description first, a physical description. They go for the inside. Yeah. That's spirit. That's the spirit. They're just like, she's the person who does this. She's whether it's good or bad. I mean, I like to believe that they say that I'm compassionate and that I'm loving, but even the things that may not feel good to the ear, that's the spirit side of me, and that manifests outward. Yeah. So all of this is just clothed in, or the best way, in the spirit of Dr. P and so many others, that I am a spiritual being having a human experience, right?
But the physical body is the vehicle.
Yes.
For the spirit.
Exactly. And that I'm clothed, like this brown skin is just clothing around the being who I am. Like who I represent, what I'm created to be, what that calling is, all that stuff on the inside. That's me. And I just get to garment myself in this brown skin, right? So, but it's taken me a long time to even get to that point. It's taken me a long time to actually realize that, to say stuff like, it's just hair, right?
Because there's so much to unpack in those things. Because form, especially in this society, form has so much meaning to people.
It does.
And we're socialized to believe that this has so much meaning.
Right.
You know? And although it does have meaning in that your form and how people perceive you affects your experiences in life. That's just a part of this human experience, especially here as Americans, as people of color, and especially Black people in America. You can't take that away, but at the same time, the form shouldn't define you. It affects you, but we're socialized. It shouldn't define. I think we're socialized to think that beauty is so important. Looking a certain way is so important. And it's interesting because it's sort of this fine balance too. Like, as professors, do I think about how I dress when I'm in class? Yeah, I do. I don't put a lot of thoughts. I mean, at some point you're like, okay, I'm just gonna wear jeans because I'm just gonna wear jeans. But I remember the first time when I was in grad school, before I started teaching as a TA, we had to do this. It was at U of M in Arbor. It was like a GSI orientation. Yeah. And they said that teaching and to be a professor is to be a performer. It's a performance.
That's one of my favorite lines.
Right? And so you do have to decide, okay, what image am I projecting and what type of person and what type of performer am I going to be? Yeah. So it's, I don't know, but I feel like the older you get, the less important those things become.
So I'm going to go with exactly that. The older you get, the more I don't care.
Yeah.
The more I don't care. I am of the same mindset. I remember I have a good friend, and I remember teaching right after I finished the degree, and I recognized that I look young to the students that I was teaching back then. And I was dressing, I can't even remember.
I still do right now.
Right? So this is the same thing where they question, they're wondering who the teacher is.
Yeah.
I remember even the attire, and this friend said, well, what do you expect? Look at the way that you dress. Now, I don't remember what I had on, but I do know this. I remember that statement based off of when I interviewed for the job that I have now, teaching at Flint. The one thing when they said, do you have any questions? My question was, am I allowed to dress any way that I want? The beautiful thing is the people who were sitting in that room, and I can't remember, I felt like there were about 4 people, but I only looked at 2 of them. One had on tattered jeans, and tennis shoes, and the other person had on a suit. And the person who had a suit said, take a look at us. And that was my response. It was kind of like, do you?
Yeah.
And I hate to admit it, but I was just like, yup, I'm going to take this job. Right? This will work. And so over a period of time, just trying to figure out what my clothing pattern looks like. And then 14 years in, I was just like, I'm a jeans, Converse kind of girl. Right?
And that's just it.
Yeah. And you have to figure that out over a period of time, right? You have to navigate what that looks like, how people respond to you. I feel like after you've been there for a period of time, they figure out, like, you can't really confuse, that's Tracy, so.
Yeah. And you go through phases. I mean, when I first started teaching, I used to wear dresses and heels every day.
Right.
And my office in the building I taught at, it was like a 10-minute walk because I used to teach at U of M Ann Arbor. And I was like, why am I doing this to myself? Right. And I remember my students would know. They're like, oh, she's coming, because they could hear, clonk, clonk, clonk.
They could hear the heels, yeah.
And now it's flats. And I don't wear my shoes in my office because I don't want to wear it. It changes. Things change.
Comfortability. But comfortability, not only necessarily in the physical in terms of walking, but just comfortability in self. Over a period of time, you're like, this is me.
Yeah.
This is what works. I remember last year I did my phase of, like, was it last year or a year before? Something like that. I did the nose piercing, and I called that rebelling. Right? So this is beautiful about this. So whereas for me, it was rebelling, and I'm not too sure who I was rebelling against. Because when I got it, and I went up to friends, and I was like, y'all, do you notice anything? And they were looking. They were just kind of looking around, and they were like, And then I was just like, you don't notice anything? This is major for me. And finally, I had to point at it, and they were just like, that's not really rebelling. Nah, that's...
Not anymore.
Something new. Yeah. So but it made me question, why did you really do that? And who were you really rebelling against? And so it may be that it was a dialogue that had more to do with my parents, because I knew how my parents would react, which was, I think my mom thought I was going to get a tattoo, which she was okay with. She was like, nose piercing.
Of all things, no, I'd rather you put ink that never goes away on your body than a piercing that you can take out.
What? So those are the things where I'm wondering, why do we do the things we do? We call it rebellion or a disruption, against norm, and then you realize that some of the things we're doing, actually, they're not so disruptive as we make them out to be. So.
And maybe they're not so much for us as we make them out to be.
There you go. Maybe they're not so much for us. Yeah. Those are the things I'm learning about self. So, but I do believe in disruption. Like, I think that's the beauty of spirit spaces, is in many ways, the spirit space for me represents inclusion. It represents inclusion in a society that does a lot of things that feel very normative. Like, this is what norm looks like. This is what a family looks like. This is what you do. And so for me, it allows me to choose people who represent, who, for whatever reason, there's a connection there. Whatever that connection is, whatever that draw in is. And so And so inclusion would be anybody and everybody can sit at the table. Now, I say that carefully.
Yeah, I was going to be like, everybody?
Right. Because I say everybody and anybody could sit at the table. I just may not want them to sit at my table, right? And so what I'm recognizing, and I remember hearing Mama Soul talk about this in one of her songs where she's like, I keep my crew tight.
Yeah.
And I think that's the table I'm talking about in terms of inclusion is what does my crew, what does my circle, what does my family, what does that look like to me? Like this is family, right? This, my friends who practice and learn spirituality across the board. One who identifies as atheist, another one agnostic, another one Eastern philosophy, like all of those things across the board. The young lady that I consider, my mentor would say, I'm the daughter she never had. I'm gonna, in the spirit of Gloria, I'm gonna say, the daughter I never had who's Muslim. Like all of those things represent inclusion for me, especially in a world or in the United States, in a society that says that we have the freedom to practice anything that we want. But in fact, do we really have the freedom to practice? Because there's a lot of people who seem to be ostracized in the ugliest way, which means I don't know if we really practice inclusion. And the minute we start talking about politics, I don't know if people believe the things that they actually say. So,
I don't think that we as a nation do.
No.
I will say that comfortably.
Yeah.
I think it's more about
right.
America. I think it's more about we as individuals. Are we inclusive?
Are we? Yes.
Because like other people may not be inclusive or include us, and we might not have a seat at certain tables, but we can create our own table.
And that's the inclusion I'm talking about, right? That's the spirit space that says, I'm going to ask this person to be a part of it. And so you may not be at this table, then you may not be a part of the Constitution or whatever document that people think is a wonderful document that didn't actually include you when it was created. Like, let's talk about what it means to be normal. And that's why, this is what comes to mind. That's why Alice Walker's The Color Purple is my favorite book. She shows me that family is women taking care of each other, right? And I remember having this dialogue with a friend where she said, well, Tracy, don't you want to... Actually, it wasn't her who said this. Someone. So we're gonna leave it right. Someone said, well, don't you want the full family? And I said, well, what is the full family? And you know what this dialogue looks like. So I'm not saying anything brand new or very deep, but the full family is like, don't you want the married and the children? And I have the cat, right? And I do have the nice house, right? I have all of those things. She's in a wonderful place. All of those things, and I'm not opposed to that. But what I do have a problem is when that becomes the norm, and if you do something else, then it becomes problematic, or you don't fit into the mold, or you're not accepted. That's what's troublesome. Yeah, that's what's an issue, especially when I'm just my spirituality today is love. It's love and light, and so, and that comes in all kinds of forms, which means, that doesn't fit norm. It feels like actually what's not norm is love and light. So that's
if you see what we're socialized, what is all the content that we see on social media, on TV, on movies and whatnot, which is why Black Panther was such an amazing movie for.
So we have to talk about that. I'm so glad you said that. I was like, can I say it?
Because it's showing something and saying this is also the norm.
This is also the norm.
Like there are so many things that are the norm. Each person, you are your own norm. Why subscribe to something that? Why subscribe to the whole keeping up with the Joneses? Why? What benefit does that do for you? And that's not to say there's anything wrong with that. I think that, of course, if you want to take the route of traditional family and you want to live in the suburbs, for instance, like the American dream, whatever it is, if that's what the norm is, it's fine if you live that way because you're choosing to do it. And if you are happy with that,
right,
then more power to you,
Right.
But if you're not, you shouldn't be ostracized and you shouldn't be told that no, that's not the right way.
That's it. As you're saying that, I was telling someone the reason why I loved Black Panther. Saw it for a second time.
So did we.
Right? Like everybody else I know, they're just like, yeah, we're going for our third.
Yep.
Right? But what I loved about the film was two things in particular. One is it reminded me of the love that I saw was family. So I loved the relationship between mother and son, brother and sister, love and love. And I would say, like The Warrior, one of my favorite scenes, there's so many, but one of my favorite scenes was when General Okoye was, I guess they brought her up on the cell phone, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, "Hello, my king. Hello, my love." And I thought that's beautiful in and of itself. Just that connection of there's many tribes in this whole space. And in that they collectively come together as one full community, and that's the village. And it's not particularly a couple, and that's it. Because I feel like in the United States, and I need to be careful because it's not like I've lived all over the world. So I want to be very clear about that. But I will say that my background in saying this has to do with some of the stories that my parents tell me, and particularly my mom told me recently. She would say that, when you come up in the family, it's okay to be the whole family live together. So that is parents, children, grandmother, grandfather, great-grandparent. Like they all live in that same household. I saw that in Wakanda. Like they may not be in the same room, but mother and siblings and king and queen, all of them are living in the same household. Where here it appears once you hit a certain age, you go off to school,
and then you leave.
And then you leave and you start your family, and that's in and of itself. You may come back to check on the elders who are getting older and stuff, but you have started your whole family. Then I know that that's one of the reasons why I'm going back to the East Coast, and I have no problems with saying I love the idea of being closer to my parents. That's important to me. Right? So that's one thing. The second thing that I loved about Black Panther were the women rocked it.
Yes.
Hardcore. I mean, King T'Challa.
They were protectors.
Right. He was cool and all. But
like...
right? There you go.
Yeah, those women.
He wouldn't be alive without those women.
It's true.
So I felt like the women rocked it no matter what role they were. Mom, brilliant sister, passionate social justice spy, queen, general warrior, scientist, all of it across the board. And I think that reminds me that women and men, we all come together in the community, but women take care of each other. That I needed to see that. It reminds me again of the color purple, that we take care of each other in our own ways.
So we're talking about spirit spaces and inclusiveness. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit. We talked about it a little bit, but we didn't use the actual word authenticness, being authentic and being truthful and honest. And I think you touched a little bit on that. You touched a little bit on it when talking about, am I doing something for myself? Am I being true to what is my spirit? Right. And am I expressing it to the best of my ability? So I guess when we talked about this a little bit before when we had the email exchange, and you talked about, okay, there's truthfulness, there's honesty, and there's authenticity. Is there a difference between these three?
Truthfulness, honesty, authenticity. So I should have looked up these words before this interview. I just want y'all to know that. Okay, truthfulness, to be true. So I'm going to break it down in terms of root, and you are so going to jump in at every moment. To be truthful. And I'm going slow so I can process this in my head.
I mean, that's a part of the process of digging deeper.
Right. Okay, so to be honest, no, to be truthful, truth. So now I feel like I need to work through the definition of what it means. What is truth?
What is truth?
What is truth?
Am I expressing the truth?
Right. And for me, that's very, one, that's philosophical, and two, that is subjective, right? Because my truth is probably different from someone else's truth.
Yeah.
Not even is, probably is. Different from someone else's truth. And I know that and so make sure I do not forget the other two.
Yeah.
I know that for sure because I even have these conversations about religion, right? And so every so often, depending on who I'm talking to, we'll talk about in context what it means for them to live. I have one person in mind, for them to live a Christian life, and then they'll look at me and I'm just like, you keep on talking about the life that you choose to live, right?
Yeah.
So that is your truth.
Yeah.
My truth has much to do with exploring and understanding spirituality without question, definitely believing in God and believing in a creator and all of that. But I'm also very careful in terms of what that looks like when we talk about truth, because every so often the dialogue looks like there's only one truth, one way. And I'm just like,
capital T and
right. So then I have to go back to that whole narrative in my heart. Now I keep on doing this as in my ear, but in my heart that says, if I believe in inclusion, then that one truth that actually does not work for me. Right? That doesn't. I feel like this is my coming out. Some people I have not said this to. So here you go. Watch the video. Right.
It's kind of like, I have this one image that I got from this printing store in Eastern Market in Detroit. And it's an image. It's really beautiful. It's like this. It's on a black sheet of paper, and in white, it has these arrows that are all pointing towards the center.
Directions.
And and all of them, they're the one direction arrows, like the sign, the street sign. So it's one direction arrows, but multiple of them, like really close to each other, all facing inwards. And the arrow itself is the shape of a heart.
Oh.
And then it all comes to that one thing. And I think, everyone has their own truth, but I think at the end, it leads almost to the same direction. We're looking for the same thing. We're looking for, what is our spirit? Who are we? What is our purpose? What is, we're trying to answer the same questions. We're just getting there a different way. Which is fine.
I do, yeah. My heart believes that's okay. However you need to do that and navigate, because life in itself is that journey, right?
Yeah.
So that's that dialogue about truth, that more than one way.
Yeah.
Truth. Honesty. So honesty, now that I'm speaking and saying it, honesty is different, right? Because that's the word you use, honesty.
Yeah.
There is being honest and not being honest. Lying. So that's the context I put honesty in. And that to me is different from truth, from my perspective, or at least my lens right now, is being honest as a friend, being honest as accountability partner, being honest as partners, companions, husband and wife, like that.
But also for yourself.
But also being honest with self, which is one of the things that I learned this past weekend, being with one of my big brothers who called me out. I feel like he should be watching this right now. I'm confessing, right? And he was just like, Tracy, you need to be honest with yourself. You're not being honest with all the things that you want to do or the things that you don't want to do. Like ground yourself. And so that in itself has a lot to do with what truth are you telling yourself? That's the honesty I'm thinking of. Is are you lying to who you are, to your spirit, to your being? And if you're lying to yourself, then that means automatically you're lying to everybody else, right? Because I start with myself first. Yeah. And then authenticity. So the word that comes to mind for authenticity is real. Yeah. But I feel like that's kind of linked to honesty and truth, but I
feel like authenticity is the expression.
Yes, it is. Thank you. That's it.
The expression of...
That is expression.
Right? Because either you are being real and true to who you are. If I believe that this is my truth, for instance, whatever that truth may be, I have to be honest with myself that I believe that this is the truth for myself. This is what's going on. And that might have to do with a belief system. That might have to do with how I see myself. Like, there's so many different things that we could be talking about, right, when we're talking about truth. So there's that truth. I accept it. I'm honest with myself. And then I'm authentic in expressing that.
There you go. That's it. That's it.
Right? We just linked it.
We just got, boom, did y'all get that?
Oh, write it down.
That's right. Take notes. No.
The test is next week.
That's it. I love it. And the more you said it, the more I was thinking to myself, my authenticity and what it means to be authentic is the creative expression. It is the artistry. It is the thing that allows me to be exactly me on stage. So some things, when it's just me off stage, whatever that off stage looks like, I'm battling through it. Yeah. But on stage, I get to be complete. I get to dress me. I get to rock me completely. Whatever that may look like, however that's manifested, along with me clothing myself in the words that I want to say to people. Like, this is the authentic me. Take it or leave it, right? Yeah. And then I get off stage, come back home. But that's expression.
But it's like, those are the expression. The beautiful thing about expression, especially like creative expression and artistry, is that you are able to say, this is such a deep part of me and who I am. And I'm not just keeping it to myself, but I want to share it. Yeah.
That's right. I want to share it with the world, or I want to share it with whomever wants it, needs it, can use it. Authenticity leads me to some of my favorite artists. I don't even know if we. Okay, so I'm just gonna go there.
Yeah, you just go there. We're there.
So some of my favorite artists, one of them being Audre Lorde. And anybody who knows, I'm usually rocking this essay in my brain like I feel the whole world needs to know this essay. The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And I love this essay. And poetry is not a luxury, just so y'all know. It's still not me, Audrey. So, but I say specifically the transformation of silence into language and action because I believe words, they breathe life and they can also destroy, right? And so she says specifically in the transformation that, I cannot afford, or you cannot afford, or all of us cannot afford to be silent. That silence actually kills. Yeah. And that when you start using your voice and you put it into language, then it begins to manifest outwardly into action. It's always interesting to me now, and I hear this a lot, that people will say, I'm tired of people talking. I get it. I'm tired of people talking too, to some degree. But
we sit here and
talk. But I do hear, I'm tired of talking and I want to see action. Yeah. I don't want any more groups. I don't want any more dialogues. Just let me see the action. But I go back to talking because some people need to talk it out. Yeah. When I talk to myself and I'm in and we know what this looks like. When I'm in the mirror and I'm staring at those sticky notes, I don't really have any sticky notes up, but I'm staring at those sticky notes that say, you are the bomb. You are like all the stuff that you have to affirm to yourself and remind yourself so that you believe it. Yeah. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That's a lie. Whoever came up with that mess, right?
Absolutely.
Names do hurt.
Worse,
right? They break, they tear up. Words to me are the transformative thing. They change, they shift. And so when she says, use your voice, you have got to speak. You speak for those who can't speak. You speak for those who are abused. You speak for those who are trying to figure out what their voice is. You speak for the Sealies of the world. I always go to Sealy, the color purple Sealy, right? Yeah. That you speak for those who keep on being quiet until they can speak. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I love her, is that she reminds me that my voice is very important. It's really important.
This is I love this because this is related to so many other topics that we did in the previous 5 episodes of Digging Deeper. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we just continue
to dig deeper. Right?
But you're right. I mean, words have power. And you can't be an advocate without using your words.
Yeah.
However that may be. You can write, you can do poetry, you can speak, there's so many, this is right here, this is an avenue, right?
It's an avenue. What I'm learning actually from this, which is really important for me, I used to be the one a little bit, some time ago. I'm gonna confess this. I'd be like, social media, down with social media. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm just, decades back. So, and then I would complain about the iGen. I'm hoping none of my students are watching this, but I would. I'd complain. I'd be like, put those phones down.
Yeah.
You're in public speaking class, And then I realized, a good friend said this to me. She said, this generation that a lot of people complain about, they call them lazy and that they're not listening and all of this stuff. And she said, actually, they're not lazy at all. They're selective. I was like, that was kind of fly, right? She was just like, they're selective. They're choosing what to pay attention to on one end. And number two, she said, they're saying things that a lot of us who are of an older generation, whatever that looks like, and whatever that age may be, they are doing things and saying things and putting things into practice, the things that we actually cannot say. And they're using social media to do it, right? And that you can't run away from that. That's the 2018 world. And until social media or until the internet shuts down, this is what we have. And if that's their avenue, then that means we support them in that. And we remind them of history. And we provide that foundation. We keep on telling stories, but you don't stop them, and you don't call them lazy, and you don't call them the "oh, woe is me" generation, because that's not the case. And that's a good check at the door.
I think so.
Yeah, it's a different perspective for me.
Yeah.
Because I was that person that was acting a fool. I'm sorry, iGen. You all are the bomb. Yes.
Hi to everyone who's waving.
Yay!
Thank you for being here.
You all are awesome.
It is pretty phenomenal what you can do with social media.
Yes.
We were just talking about this in the car last week. I had this idea of doing this show, Digging Deeper. If this was a couple of decades ago, let's say just even 1 decade ago.
Right.
If I wanted to do this, what platform would I do it on? How would I reach people?
Was there something? MySpace?
Yeah, MySpace.
Not live though.
But you couldn't.
Oh no, you're right.
You couldn't
not
do
live.
it live. This is great, right? Because you've got people here, and everyone who's here, you guys, if you want to comment things, if you want to ask questions or just add to the dialogue, feel free to.
Right.
Like the fact that we can do this and have a live conversation with people some of whom I don't even know. You know,
that's so cool.
And that you don't have to take this. I don't have to take this show and do a pitch to like a TV. To a network or to anything. I can just say, I'm doing this.
You don't need their permission.
You didn't need their permission. You just do it. Create a website. Do it on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever medium you're using.
Yeah.
And you can just do it.
Yeah. I love that.
And the thing that is beautiful, and we were talking about this on Mahogany's episode, where we were talking about advocacy, but when you're curating these spaces on these social media forums, you have to choose. What is important is that you have to be careful about yourself and how authentic you are being in that while you're curating that space, and to not use it. It of course is a barrier. There's like the separation between me and you if we're just talking to each other online.
Right.
But how much of myself am I going to share with you? How honest am I going to be about who I am and what my experiences are? And I think that is where you can take this, dreaded social media,
right,
and flip it.
Right.
But it's just a matter of, am I doing that? And on the other hand, constantly questioning ourselves. Why am I doing this? Why am I continuing to do
What's
this?
Your intention?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your
intention? Intentions are huge. We've got another comment here.
What?
Oh, Kosar from Morocco. Hey,
from Morocco?
Greetings from Robot. What's the subject again? We're talking about spirit spaces and honesty and expression.
So we just reached Morocco. So this is a beautiful thing about, obviously, social media, global. Right. I love that. Like this, for me, is a global conversation, and that it reaches across lines, which is why this is why
here.
There you go. Inclusion, to me, I don't know
Everyone's
how
at the table. You got all these people at the table
just prove
from
my
different places.
Yes. I need Washington, D.C. to see this.
to do this right here.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's...
Right.
That's inclusion.
Sit at the table. Right. That's so important.
And to say that we're going to get together, we're going to use social media, we're going to get together, but we're going to have really deep conversations about things that are true to ourselves and things that maybe are uncomfortable, things that maybe we need to work on. I mean, I'm going to say this myself. I definitely need to work on it. Everyone, I feel like you're a constant work in progress. That's the nature of being human.
Right.
And if you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm done.
I'm perfect.
Like,
you can't see this. So perfect, right?
There's a problem there.
Right.
You know, then are you being honest with yourself?
No.
At that point.
Or at least not right to me. But this is a funny thing. I think that some people don't even realize that they're not being honest with themselves, right? Like, that's the dialogue I had with someone recently. They got to this point where, we had the dialogue of, you know, I have all this information and I know it and I feel equipped and stuff. And I'm just like, but, you know, after you have that information, that ball of information, there's so much to know. I have all these books on this shelf, and I'd like to tell people that I've read all those books. I mean, it looks good. It looks really fancy.
I love to do that too. I've got an entire study room.
Right? But I haven't.
Yeah.
Right? That same old thing. The older I get, the more I realize I don't know. And the more books come out, and then there's always something to learn.
There's always something. We have a comment. What's the greatest lesson that life has taught you? I guess up until now.
So, yeah, because I was going to say, honestly.
Yes,
since I am still living life, I don't know. So up until this point, there's not one greatest lesson. There are many. So that's one of the greatest lessons, is that every single day is a lesson. Every single day I am realizing I'm a work in progress. I feel like it's too common to say that, but when I say I'm a work in progress, I am such a work in progress. I am realizing that I am uncomfortable in my skin. One. I am realizing that I come out of a bit of a family at times. Love my family. Hope they're not watching. So, love my family. That showing vulnerability is a bit of a challenge for us. And so one of the other lessons is that in order for me to talk about healing, in order for me to talk about trauma and ask my students to be vulnerable, which is what I do in the spoken word course, guess who also needs to be vulnerable? And that's hard as all get out. Which is why that class is a very uncensored class. So it gets colorful in language. Like this right now is PG, right? For me, in terms of, but in that course, it's almost a requirement to uncensor that so students can tell their stories the way it comes out, the way it sits on their chest. And so, because you can't censor people's stories, that's a lesson for me. And that's a hard lesson.
What are some ways, since we've got a few minutes left?
Okay. Wow, are you serious?
Yeah, it flies by.
It really does. I want another hour. No,
you're like no.
Just kidding.
When you're teaching that course, 5 minutes.
3 minutes.
Huh?
Oh wow.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Mine shows 5.
Okay.
Maybe. Well, you're taking away time now. What are some of the ways that you instill in your students or teach them to be honest and authentic in that expression and in that storytelling?
Few things. One is I actually do my own confession lesson. So I was told a long time ago, no one, you don't go through school on, at least for me, I didn't go through school on how to be a teacher. There is no how-to class, at least when I was walking through. I did bumps, I fell down, I tried to get up, I had crutches and trying to be a teacher, all of those things. And in those lessons of falling and falling and falling again, it is, you never show them any weakness. Vulnerability is a no-no. Show them that you're always brilliant. All of those things. So when I bring it back to now, I tell my students something that is personal, because I'm asking them to write stories about themselves and also to be personal. And so in 15 weeks, we are working on ourselves across the board with each other, which means I have to not only be a teacher, but most importantly, I have to be a student. And so so we do confession, not confession like we're laying on the table, I'm the psychiatrist or anything like that.
Let me tell you all my deep dark secrets and sins.
No, like none of that. No, but what we honestly do is they have the right to ask me anything, right? I have the right to
Oh, I don't know if I like that.
I'm about to close it.
I have the right to
You got a minute.
to say I have the right to possibly to say that I'm not comfortable enough to speak on that, but give me some time and I'll share a little something. And if I could just get there, share a little piece, then that's my first step to being vulnerable, and then they're willing to share a little something. My job for 15 weeks is to create a safe space, and it begins with me. So
going back to that spirit space. Before you share with us some expression, do you want to, we had a question about book recommendations, but I know you wanted to talk a little bit.
Book recommendations. Oh,
Recommendations or just daily practices, just
yes.
Any sort of last minute
Thanks.
thoughts, yeah.
My book recommendation is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. I love her because she's the one who talks about poetry is not a luxury. So for those who are artists, those who are women, those who are trying to figure it out, those who want to disrupt the norm, that's a good book because it's called Sister Outsider, right? Another one is that's coming off the top of my head is I always talk about The Color Purple, especially I feel like it's a book for everybody. But I'm gonna say for me it's a woman's book in terms of empowerment. Like it really felt good. And I love that you get to own your own language. So Celie is writing a letter to God, and it's in the language that she knows. And that shows me that, the world tells you to shape, reshape, talk this way. Celie's like, I'm talking the way I know how to talk. And so that's all about owning voice. And Alice Walker does that beautifully. Owning voice. I'm actually reading right now 2 books. I don't know if these are books that I'm suggesting. I'm just letting you know that this is a part of my practice. That one of the books is Autobiography of a Yogi. I would have a lot of friends who do yoga, and it felt uncomfortable. It felt uncomfortable being in big groups. And out there, I didn't have any yoga anything, so I was just like, But what I did do was I decided to pick up the book that was given to me as a gift. Okay. And now I appreciate the process of understanding why people do yoga, but understanding yoga as a lifestyle by reading about it from the person who is a yogi. And so that Yogananda, that book is really important to me. So that practice is that every morning I read a little bit each and every day. And then also aside of that is I pick up another book that I could just make sure that my mind is reading, and that's a book that's for me. And so right now I am reading, as they say, rereading Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And then another practice for me is writing in a journal. And I just started that again. So there you go. Right. I used to write in one, I took a break, and then after this spiritual retreat, I came back because I was told it's time for me to get back to writing. Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I took this journal out, and this is one that I started writing in 2012. And they were just ideas that I had. I applied for Fulbright, so I wrote about like my Fulbright application. Yes. Like just
have that, right.
Just ideas and things, and I was reading it in the car on the way up here, and we're in Flint, by the way, for those
Flint town. I don't know if there's like a Flint sign, but I love Flint, so there you go. Flint's a gem.
And just jotting down ideas and thoughts.
And hold your book up.
It's nice and compact.
Right.
Just stick it in my purse.
Yeah. Like there's this notion that journals have to be like really fancy, whereas okay, so I'm gonna show you my journal. Here we go. It's big, okay?
Girl, that take up the whole space. There you go.
I know. So I bought it, and so now I'm starting to write. I don't carry it everywhere because it's big.
Which is why this is why I started buying small ones.
Important.
Because then I would carry them.
Right. Yeah.
Then I would carry them.
So
I have that one, but in yellow.
Oh,
wrap the journal.
This one, the small one.
The small one or the big one?
Actually, I have another journal that a friend gifted to me. This is a journal that I have that was given to me by another bestie, and so what I wrote in this were actually poems, like just poetry after poetry, like some of my greatest work comes out of this.
What do you write in your journal every day? doings, ideas, plan. Yeah, ideas, poetry, one-liners.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have like just one-liners.
You know, I have different. So in
It just depends.
It depends. That's it. Certain journals are for one-liners. Certain journals are for poetry. Certain journals are stories and stuff. This one is actually writing about the spiritual space that I'm in now these days. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to share something with us?
All right, here we go. So this is what I want to close out with, and maybe this is it. After talking about spirit space, I realized the thing for me, spirit space is the thing that we create, and I think that spiritual space moves beyond geography, that it transcends that, and it starts with the self, right? And so I wrote this. I love Nina Simone. I feel like everybody seems to go to for women, and so I'm going to be one of those people who does that. And I read her book about I Put a Spell on You, and she talked about why she wrote for women, about black women, but black women in different textures, different skin color, different tones, hairstyles, everything. And she said that, you know, we have to figure out who we are when she wrote this. And so it came out in 1966. And so for me, when I wrote this, what I did, I have a tendency when I love songs, I change the words around so I can take ownership. And so it begins with her first stanza. I go into poem and then I come back as a way of changing it around so I can be empowered. So for anybody who knows, sing it along with me. She's like my, you know, you should just sing this with
just
me.
do
Okay, I know. Clearly I get uncomfortable with poetry. Okay, so she has, my skin is black, my arms are long, my hair is woolly, my back is strong. Strong enough to take the pain, inflicted again and again. What do they call me? My name is Aunt Sarah. From the southern tips of Gullah, returning to her land, she mounted from the hilltops to save them from his hands. Leather-belted wounds written on their backs, singing songs of caged birds, babies hung from racks. Terms of endearment, black hearses she redeems, but the owning of her name, how we break from the seams. I call 4 generation of women, blood curdled from each lash. Man unscrupled by his power, unfazed and unattached. 4 generations, women come scream aloud, 4 broken chains, 4 centuries prouds. And then I return back to the song. My skin is black, my arms are long, my hair is woolly, my back is strong. Strong enough to take the pain, inflicted again and again. What do they call me? They call me beauty. Yes. That was written in this book.
That was. Yes. Well, with that, that is another episode of Digging Deeper. Thank you so much. So much. We said profound.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for being here, for having this conversation. An ongoing conversation. It's not going to end, you know. It's just, I feel like we've scraped the surface a little bit, and
we did.
You know, and maybe got a couple of things that we can go home and think about for ourselves. But yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you.
I loved it.
This was great. It wasn't as bad as
no,
as
it wasn't. I was freaking out. I was trying to study for this interview, right?
And I was like, it's not an interview. It's just a conversation.
It's not. Right. So I really didn't study though.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for watching. And until next time, bye. Peace, joy.
Bye.
Be honest, be authentic, be yourself, and live to the fullest. Have a blessed day, and thanks for sharing.
Thank you.